A patient flatlines at 2:47 a.m. The monitors scream. The crash team floods the room. But Nora Callahan is already standing at the doorway, and she isn't moving, because she's seen this exact sequence 3 times in 11 days. Same vitals, same collapse window, same unlabeled vial pulled from the same refrigerated drawer 30 minutes before. The team works the code. They lose him anyway. And when the attending physician finally steps back and calls the time, he doesn't look at the dead man on the table. He looks at Nora. And what she reads in his face isn't grief. It's calculation. If this story already has your pulse going, stay with me. Follow the channel, hit like, and drop the name of the city you're watching from in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go. Vandermeer Medical Center occupied 6 floors of glass and reinforced concrete on the eastern edge of Caldwell Falls, Oregon. A mid-sized city that liked to describe itself as progressive without doing much to earn the word. The hospital's reputation was sterling in the way that expensive things often are, polished on every visible surface, hollow in the places no one thought to check. Its website used phrases like patient-centered excellence and innovation in healing. The parking structure had the hospital's name on it in raised bronze letters. The gift shop sold flowers at 4 times the going rate, and nobody complained because the people buying them were too distracted to notice. Nora Callahan had been working the night shift in the medical surgical unit for 2 years and 3 months, long enough to know which supply closets had broken locks, which attending physicians wrote pain management orders based on who was watching, and which family members of long-term patients had stopped asking questions because the answers had stopped mattering to them. She was 34, compact and quiet, in the way that people who grew up moving around a lot tend to be. Efficient with space, careful with trust, comfortable in silence. She wore her brown hair pulled back so tightly, it gave her a slightly severe look that she'd never once tried to soften. She didn't need colleagues to like her. She needed them to do their jobs. She'd come to Vandermeer after a period she referred to as transitioning out of federal service, which she never elaborated on. Her nursing credentials were real and current. Her references checked out. Her background check returned clean. The hiring supervisor, a woman named Gretchen, had noted during the intake interview that Nora seemed overqualified for a staff nurse position and had asked, not unkindly, whether she'd considered a management track. Nora had said she preferred direct patient care. Gretchen had nodded and moved on, and that was the end of it. Nobody at Vandermeer knew that Nora had spent 6 years as a combat medic attached to a special operations unit, rotating through 3 different theaters in conditions that had no civilian equivalent. Nobody knew she'd done 2 subsequent years of federal contractor work, classification level she still couldn't discuss over an open line, or that her ability to assess a threat environment, identify anomalies in complex systems, and maintain composure while processing information that would unravel. Most people had been built under conditions that made a hospital night shift look serene. She wasn't hiding it, exactly. She just hadn't had occasion to bring it up. She'd taken a job as a staff nurse. That was what she was here to do. The first death that bothered her was a 57-year-old man named Gerald Ostroff. He'd been admitted for a pulmonary embolism that was, by every clinical metric, manageable. Standard anticoagulation therapy. Stable presentation on admission. The attending had him on a reasonable protocol, and Gerald Ostroff was the kind of patient who cooperated fully because he was scared enough to take his situation seriously. A retired high school shop teacher who'd called his daughter twice a day from his hospital bed and asked Nora each morning whether she thought he'd be home by the weekend. She told him she thought so. On the 3rd night of his admission, Gerald Ostroff went into sudden multi-organ failure at approximately 2 a.m. The crash team worked him for 38 minutes. They lost him at 2:41. Nora had been on shift. She'd helped run the code. Afterward, standing in the corridor outside his room while the team broke down the equipment, she'd gone over his last 12 hours of vitals in her head with the kind of precision that most people reserve for things they could write down. The deterioration had been fast. Too fast, and in a direction that didn't align cleanly with his presentation. She'd flagged the anticoagulant dose to the covering physician that night, a rapid young resident named Ferris, who'd given her the look that junior doctors gave nurses when they wanted to communicate that the conversation was professionally over. She'd documented her observation in the chart notes regardless. Gerald Ostroff was already dead, But documentation was documentation. She filed it as a tragedy. She moved on. She would have kept filing it that way if it hadn't been for Marcus Webb. Marcus Webb was 44, admitted after a workplace accident. Blunt trauma, broken ribs, no internal bleeding on initial imaging. His prognosis was good. He was large and loud and complained about everything with the particular energy of a man who wasn't actually that sick. The food was terrible. The bed was uncomfortable. The overnight nurses were too quiet and it creeped him out. Did anyone watch actual television anymore, or just those medical dramas that got everything wrong? He told Nora she seemed like she could use a sense of humor, and she told him she had one. She was just saving it for something worthwhile. He'd laughed at that. On his fourth night, he coded. Nora wasn't his assigned nurse that shift, but she was 30 feet away when the monitors triggered. She helped run the code. By the time the team reached him, his organ function had deteriorated at a rate that bore no relationship to his admission diagnosis. He died at 2:51 a.m. She stood in the hallway afterward with the crash cart still beside her and pulled up his chart on the nearest terminal. She read through the prior 14 hours of documentation. The medication administration record was clean, the vitals trending was consistent with a stable patient. Nothing in the record explained what she'd just watched happen to Marcus Webb's body. She stood at that terminal for a long time. Long enough that one of the residents asked if she was okay, and she said yes, she was fine, and logged off and went back to her assigned patients. But she wasn't filing it as a tragedy anymore. She was counting. The third death put an end to the counting phase entirely. Patricia Gund was 69, admitted for a cardiac arrhythmia that was serious but manageable, the kind of case that, properly treated, sent people home in 5 to 7 days with a modified prescription list and instructions to reduce sodium. She was sharp, direct, didn't like small talk, and had an opinion about every piece of equipment in her room, most of them negative. Nora had liked her immediately. The unit was short-staffed that Tuesday, and Nora had picked up tasks across the floor. She'd been in Patricia Gunn's room 3 times in a single shift, once to check vitals, once to administer a scheduled medication, and once because the woman's TV remote had slid behind the bed rail and she wasn't going to ask twice. That last time, leaning behind the rail to retrieve the remote, Nora's eyes moved across the IV fluid bag above the bed out of pure reflex. The same sweep she gave every patient environment every time she entered it, a habit so deeply ingrained it didn't feel like a habit anymore. She handed the remote to Patricia Gund. She looked at the IV bag. The label was almost right. Not wrong in any dramatic way. Not missing information, not obviously incorrect, just printed in a font that was a fraction of a point smaller than the hospital's standard pharmacy label format. The kind of detail that lived below the threshold of conscious observation for most people. Most people's eyes would have continued moving. Nora's stopped. She said she'd be right back. She stepped out. She walked to the medication room and pulled 3 IV bags from the standard supply and held their labels next to the photograph she'd taken on her phone through the doorway. A habit from her other life. Document everything before you touch anything. The font difference was consistent. Not a printing error. A different template. She went back to the room. She found a reason to check the bag more closely. She noted the lot number. She ran a cross-check against the hospital's documented pharmacy inventory on the unit terminal. The lot number didn't exist in the system. Patricia Gund died at 3:08 a.m. that morning. Nora was in the break room when it happened, drinking coffee that had gone cold, staring at the wall and running through the geometry of what she'd been accumulating for 11 days. She heard the code called overhead. She sat with the cold coffee and did not get up for a full minute. Then she stood, walked to the supply room, opened the refrigerated medication drawer, the specific one she'd noted being accessed before each deterioration event, and removed a vial that was not logged in the unit's inventory. She put it in her jacket pocket. She did this without hesitation, without visible agitation, without looking around the room. The particular composure required to take a deliberate action in a high-risk environment without broadcasting it was not something you developed in a hospital. You either had it or you didn't. Nora had spent years making sure she had it. Dr. Victor Salter came onto the floor the next morning with the specific energy of a man who decided before he arrived how every conversation on his service was going to end. He was 61, chief of medical surgical, and he operated on the implicit institutional authority of someone who'd been doing this long enough that his seniority had become a form of argument that didn't require elaboration. He rounded with 2 residents and a third-year medical student, and he moved through the floor with the brisk efficiency of someone who had meetings after this. Nora intercepted him at the nursing station. "Dr. Salter, I'd like to discuss the Gund case." He didn't stop walking. Gund was a 69-year-old with significant cardiac history. These outcomes happen. 3 times in 11 days, same presentation window, same approximate pre-event timeline. He stopped then. He turned. The look he gave her was the look she'd cataloged in exactly this kind of man. Not anger, not quite. The articulation of a boundary, politely framed, non-negotiable. "Are you the attending physician on this service?" "No." "Then these cases are not your clinical responsibility." "I'm describing a pattern across 3 patients." "You're describing grief or burnout or both." He glanced at the residents behind him, a brief, calibrated look that communicated something to them about how this exchange was to be understood. "If you have documentation concerns, bring them to your charge nurse. That's the appropriate channel." He turned and continued down the hallway. One of the residents, a young woman with dark circles under her eyes that suggested she hadn't slept in longer than she should have, caught Nora's gaze for a fraction of a second as she passed. There was something in that look. Not apology. Not quite solidarity. Something smaller than both caught between them. Nora filed a formal concern through the charge nurse as instructed. She received an automated acknowledgement within the hour. No follow-up came. She submitted a written incident summary to the Quality and Safety Office. She received a reply 4 days later, form language clearly templated, informing her that the cases had been reviewed and found to be consistent with the expected mortality profile for the patient population. She had expected exactly this. She wasn't working through official channels because she believed they'd act. She was building a documented record that she had tried. The hospital's administrative wing occupied the 3rd floor, and it was a different country from the floors above it. Carpeted, quieter. The lighting was warmer, and the air held none of the antiseptic undertone that saturated the rest of the building. It smelled instead like the particular neutrality of places where decisions were made about other places, the institutional equivalent of a room that had been professionally furnished to project competence without revealing much about the people inside it. CEO Damon Fordy's office anchored the far end of a corridor lined with framed commendations and a Joint Commission certification displayed at eye level in a frame that cost more than most of the equipment on the 6th floor. He was 52, broad-shouldered, with the kind of grooming that communicated effort without appearing to. He ran Vandermeer with genuine operational competence. His budgeting was disciplined. His staff turnover numbers were enviable. His relationships with the hospital board were carefully maintained. He was good at this job, which made the other things he was doing possible in ways that pure incompetence wouldn't have allowed. He took his calls in the office with the door closed. On the morning of Patricia Gunn's death, before her body had left the floor, Ford was on a call with a woman named Sylvia Torrance. Her title at a company called Helix Corp read, Director of Strategic Partnerships. The activities it covered bore no particular relationship to either partnerships or strategy in any conventional sense. Phase 1 results are within acceptable range, Torrance said. Her voice was even and completely without affect. The voice of someone who'd long since excised anything approximating emotional investment from professional communications. The compound demonstrates the expected metabolic interference signature. Patient selection criteria are performing as modeled. How much longer before Phase 2 authorization? Ford asked. Phase 2 requires 6 confirmed subjects. Current count puts you at 4. A pause. 3, Ford said, and then caught himself checking the document on his screen. 3 confirmed. The web case was confirmed by our team yesterday. That gives you 4. His jaw tightened. He didn't respond immediately. Review your documentation, Damon, Torrance said. Not unkindly, just matter of fact. I have it here. He was reading the log. 4, yes. Phase 2 authorization pending Phase 1 closeout. 3 to 4 weeks if the collection schedule proceeds without interruption. It will. He hung up, sat for a moment looking at his desk, then called his assistant to confirm his afternoon calendar. He didn't know that Nora Callahan had already taken a vial from the refrigerated drawer on the 6th floor. He didn't know that she'd been cross-referencing pharmacy records in her head for 11 days, or that she was doing it with a level of systematic precision that his entire administrative apparatus wasn't equipped to anticipate. He wouldn't have expected it from a night shift nurse. That was the kind of assumption that cost people everything. On her next day off, Nora drove 45 miles south of Caldwell Falls to a private diagnostics lab she'd spent 2 hours researching. Independent operation, no hospital affiliations, no contracts with any regional medical network she could trace. She paid cash at the front desk. She told the intake tech she was running a private wellness panel and included the vial contents as an unlabeled compound she wanted, screened for pharmacological activity. She left her personal phone in the car and used a prepaid unit she'd bought at a gas station with cash 2 days earlier. While the screen ran, she sat in the parking lot in her car with a gas station coffee and thought through what she was doing. Not anxiously, methodically. She made a list in her head, actual list, indexed, the way she'd been trained to think through threat assessments when the margin for error was low enough that informal thinking got people killed. What she had confirmed: 3 patients dead with converging symptom profiles at similar points in their hospitalization. 1 IV bag labeled with a non-standard font and an unregistered lot number. A vial from a refrigerated drawer that appeared in no unit inventory log, accessed consistently in a window preceding each patient deterioration. What she suspected: administered unapproved compound, selected patient population, institutional cover, scope unknown, origin unknown. What she had no account for yet: whether this was a single physician acting alone or something with structural reach. Whether the compound was experimental in the conventional research sense or something else entirely. Whether the people behind it had any awareness of her. She gave the coincidence scenario honest weight. She'd been trained to do this, to model the alternative explanation with as much rigor as the primary one, because confirmation bias killed people just as efficiently as bad actors did. She held the grief and burnout explanation that Salter had offered her and turned it over and looked at it from every angle. It didn't hold. The numbers didn't support it. The lab result was going to tell her what she already suspected, and then she was going to have to decide what to do with that. The technician called her back in the afternoon. He was in his mid-40s with the professional detachment of someone who processed unusual requests regularly enough not to be startled by them. That detachment had a small crack in it when he handed her the printed panel across the counter. "I added a notation at the bottom," he said, with the careful neutrality of a man who was being precise without being alarmist. The compound flagged in the screening. The pharmacological signature is unusual, not something in the commercial database. She read the notation. Synthetic derivative, possible experimental origin. Metabolic interference profile consistent with targeted cardiovascular research application. Not commercially available. Classification may correspond to restricted federal pharmacological research categories. She folded the paper and put it in her jacket pocket. "Is there anything else you need?" the technician asked. "No, thank you." She walked out into the afternoon and sat in her car for a long time before she started it. Restricted federal pharmacological research categories. She knew those categories. She'd had clearance-level access to the federal research classification system during her contractor years. The notation on that lab paper connected to a class of compounds she hadn't expected to encounter outside of that context. Research that had been conducted under Department of Defense oversight, never cleared for civilian application, never greenlit for human trials through any legitimate pathway. Someone had taken something out of that pipeline and brought it here. The cold that settled in her chest wasn't fear. It was recognition. She returned to work 2 nights later and changed nothing visible about herself. She clocked in, completed patient assessments, administered medications with the same verification process she always used, documented with the same thoroughness. She didn't approach Salter again. She didn't escalate to quality and safety. She smiled at the right moments and kept her face composed in the way that cost her nothing now because she'd paid for it already, in full, in other places. She watched instead. She mapped access to the refrigerated drawer against patient deterioration timelines, working from memory and the photographs on her phone. She cross-referenced nursing schedules to identify which staff members were consistently present during the relevant windows, not as suspects, but as a data set. She tracked physician orders for the specific patient profile that matched the deaths. What the pattern revealed was not chaotic. That was the thing that unsettled her most. Chaos left irregular traces. Chaos was imprecise. What she was mapping had the clean geometry of a designed system. Sequential, purposeful, operating on a schedule. Someone had built this. They'd built it inside a functioning hospital, inside standard care protocols, in a way that made each individual death look like an outcome rather than an act. That took resources. That took access. That took people above the level of a single attending physician. On her fourth night back, she was finishing documentation at a terminal near the station when one of the junior nurses, a 25-year-old named Becca, who'd been on the unit for 8 months and still had the quality of someone who hadn't yet fully decided whether to trust her own instincts, stopped beside her and kept her voice low. "Can I ask you something weird?" Nora kept her eyes on the screen. "Probably. The medication deliveries. I've been noticing the overnight cart. It comes up at different times than the schedule shows. And there's a notation on the delivery confirmation that I've never seen before. I looked it up in the formulary guide, and it wasn't there." A pause. "I probably sound insane." "You don't." Nora turned to look at her fully. "Have you mentioned this to anyone else?" "No. I almost brought it up to Salter, but—" She stopped. "Don't," Nora said. "Don't bring it to anyone on the floor. Not yet." Becca looked at her for a moment. "How not yet are we talking?" "I don't know yet. Just keep documenting what you notice, privately, and don't change anything about how you work." Becca nodded. She didn't look comforted. She looked like someone who had just had a suspicion confirmed that she'd been hoping would turn out to be wrong. Nora understood that feeling. That night, Nora pulled the pharmacy delivery logs for the prior 6 weeks. She needed supervisor-level access for that, which she didn't have. But she knew that the charge nurse, Paulette, kept her credentials in a password manager she accessed from the shared nursing station terminal. Paulette had walked her through a reconciliation process months ago, handed her the keyboard without hesitation, the way you did with a colleague you trusted. Nora hadn't been planning to use that information. She'd stored it anyway, because she stored everything. She wasn't comfortable with what she was doing. She did it anyway. The logs showed exactly what she'd suspected. Specific cart designations appearing outside the standard delivery matrix, a secondary notation coding system that matched nothing in the hospital's documented formulary, a rotation pattern that aligned within 30 to 90 minutes of each patient deterioration she'd mapped. She photographed the screen. She logged out. She cleared the session history. What she didn't know, what she found out later, much later, in circumstances that were already well past the point of no return, was that the supervisor-level session she'd accessed had triggered an automated alert to the hospital's IT security monitoring system, and that the notification had been routed, per standing protocol, to the office on the 3rd floor. The call came at the beginning of her next scheduled shift, before she'd done anything more than clip her badge to her scrubs. "Administration needs to see you," Gretchen's voice, carefully neutral. The specific register of someone delivering a message they've been told to deliver without interpretation. "3rd floor, now, please." Forday was standing when she entered his office. People who were fully confident in a meeting sat down. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. She sat. He remained standing, which told her everything she needed to know about how he'd decided this conversation was going. "We've become aware of unauthorized access to hospital systems." "I accessed pharmacy delivery records," Nora said. "Yes." He paused. The directness had disrupted whatever script he'd prepared. "That access required credentials you don't have authorization to use." "It did. Can you explain your reasoning?" "I was investigating a pattern of patient deaths." The office was very quiet. Ford looked at her the way a man looks at a problem he needs to categorize before he acts on it. "That's a serious allegation. 3 patients in 11 days with converging symptom profiles and unexplained deterioration timelines. Yes, it is. Nora. A register shift. Not soft, precisely. Recalibrating. You're a skilled nurse. Your reviews have been strong. But this kind of unsanctioned investigation, it creates patient safety liability, it violates staff privacy protocols, and it undermines the clinical chain of command. We can't function if individual staff members are conducting their own parallel investigations based on Gerald Ostroff, Marcus Webb, Patricia Gund. She said the names clearly, not loudly, just clearly. 3 patients. Something moved through Ford's expression so quickly she almost missed it. Not guilt. She didn't think it was guilt. More like the adjustment a system makes when a variable behaves unexpectedly. I'm placing you on administrative leave pending a review of the unauthorized access incident, he said. Your credentials have been suspended effective this morning. She looked at him. You're suspending me for looking at pharmacy logs. I'm suspending you for unauthorized system access. She stood. She picked up her bag. I have documentation, she said. Ford said nothing. His expression was closed and entirely controlled. I documented everything, she said again. And this time it wasn't for his benefit. It was for her own. The act of saying it out loud, marking the moment. The way she used to call out position bearings in the field when communications were uncertain, so that what came next would have a reference point. She walked out. In the elevator, descending, she opened her phone and navigated to an encrypted message application she'd maintained for almost 3 years without using. The contact on the other end belonging to someone she'd worked with in a context she still couldn't name in writing. She composed 2 sentences. No patient names, no hospital name, no specific allegations, just a time, a location, and 4 words. I have the samples. She sent it. She put the phone back in her jacket. The lobby came up around her. Morning shift arriving, nurses and techs and environmental services staff moving through the glass and concrete space with the forward-leaning energy of people who had too much to do and not enough of anything to do it with. She watched them for a moment. People who came in every day to keep other people alive in a building that was quietly killing patients on a schedule. She walked through the automatic doors and into the cold Oregon morning. Her phone rang before she reached her car. She answered it. They found the lab, the voice said. Male. Controlled. Someone who'd received her message and moved fast. How long ago? We clocked the vehicle arrival at 11 minutes. 2 individuals, no marked identification. She thought through the implications in the time it took her to get to her car, unlock it, and get in. The lab technician had her cash payment and a prepaid unit number that was already deactivated. The compound screen results existed in printed form in her jacket pocket and on the lab's internal system. If they had access to the lab system, they had her screening request. They didn't have her name, but they had the results, which meant they now knew that someone had run that compound, and that someone had gotten back a result consistent with what it actually was. How much do they know? The voice asked. Enough to panic, she said, which means enough to start closing things down. What do you have? She went through it, the lab report, the photographs of the pharmacy logs, the vile chain of custody, the pattern documentation she'd built from memory and observation over 11 days. It's enough to open a federal investigation, the voice said. I know. I need you somewhere secure in the next 4 hours. I'll be at the secondary address in 2. She put the car in drive and pulled out of the hospital parking structure at exactly the speed limit. In her peripheral vision, the Vandermeer Medical Center building grew smaller in the rearview mirror. 6 floors of glass and concrete and bronze letter signage, and whatever was happening inside it, quiet and scheduled and hidden in plain sight inside standard care protocols. Behind her, on the 6th floor, a patient in room 614. A 51-year-old man 4 days into admission for a gastrointestinal condition reached for his call button as his vision began to blur at the edges. His fingers found it. He pressed. The call light blinked on at the nursing station. The nurse assigned to his room was on break. The float nurse covering the station had 3 simultaneous requests on the board and ranked them by urgency the way she'd been trained to. Vitals first, pain management second, call light requests third, because call lights were usually questions about the television. The light blinked. Room 614's monitor, 30 feet from a terminal no one was currently watching, showed his heart rate begin to climb in a pattern that Nora Callahan would have recognized in under 4 seconds. 6 minutes passed before anyone answered. The man in room 614 survived. His name was Roy Tapper, and he survived because a traveling nurse named Delia, who'd been pulled from the float pool to cover 2 floors simultaneously, happened to walk past his door on her way to a linen supply closet and saw through the window that he wasn't right. She didn't wait for the call light protocol. She went in, checked his vitals, saw the numbers, and called the code herself, fast and loud, and without asking anyone's permission. The crash team brought him back. He was transferred to the ICU with a diagnosis of acute cardiac event, etiology under investigation, which was the medical record's way of saying they didn't know why a man admitted for a gastrointestinal complaint had nearly died in his room on day 4 of what should have been a routine admission. Delia told the charge nurse afterward that she had noticed the IV line looked like it had been accessed recently. The port seal had that slight tackiness of something that had been opened and reclosed. She didn't know what to make of it. She put it in her nursing note and went back to her double-floor coverage because there were 12 other patients who needed her and she didn't have time to make it mean more than it meant yet. The nursing note would matter later. Everything would matter later. But right now, Nora was 40 miles south of Caldwell Falls on a state highway with both hands on the wheel and a phone on the passenger seat that had gone quiet after the last call. The Oregon landscape was flat and gray-green in the early morning, scrubland and power lines and the occasional billboard for a personal injury attorney or a fast food franchise whose nearest location was 30 miles in the other direction. She drove with the particular focus of someone who had calculated the risk of her current situation and arrived at a number that was uncomfortable but workable. She'd operated in worse margins. The secondary address was a property outside a small town called Renwick. Not a safe house in any cinematic sense, just a house, owned by a retired federal contractor named Walt Oberg, who had 3 dogs and grew vegetables he didn't particularly like eating, and who owed Nora a favor of the kind that didn't expire. She'd called ahead from the prepaid unit. He'd said come, and that was the end of the conversation because Walt didn't do elaboration. She pulled up the long gravel drive at 8:47 a.m. The dogs came out first. Walt came out second, coffee in hand, wearing a flannel shirt that had seen better decades. "You look like you haven't slept," he said. "I've been awake since 3. Come in." The kitchen table was already cleared. Walt had the instincts of someone who understood that when a person called ahead without details, the details were going to need space to be laid out. He put a mug in front of her and sat across the table and looked at her without asking anything, which was one of the things she'd always found valuable about him. She laid it out, all of it. The 3 deaths, the timeline pattern, the non-standard IV label, the vial, the lab result, the pharmacy log photographs, the secondary coding notation, what she recognized about the compound classification. She spoke in the flat, sequenced way she'd been trained to brief. Facts first, interpretation second, gaps flagged explicitly. No editorializing, no emotional framing, just the data and what it meant. Walt listened without interrupting. He was 63, had spent 22 years in federal investigative work before he'd burned out and bought the property and planted vegetables he didn't like eating. He had the capacity of someone who'd processed a lot of information that was bad. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You know what classification category that compound sits in," he said. "Not a question." "Yes. And you understand what it means that it's in a civilian hospital?" "Yes." He turned his coffee mug in his hands. "Who's the contact you messaged?" "Marcus Feld." She watched Walt's face. "You know him." "I know of him." A pause that meant more than what followed it. "He's solid, but the apparatus he works through, but that's not going to move quietly. Once you hand this to that level, it goes where it goes." "I know. And you're okay with that." She thought about Gerald Ostroff calling his daughter twice a day from his hospital bed. She thought about Marcus Webb laughing at her terrible sense of humor. She thought about Patricia Goon's opinion of every piece of equipment in her room. She thought about Roy Tapper in room 614 reaching for a call button while his monitor climbed. "I'm okay with it," she said. Walt nodded. "You need to document what you have in a format that survives your phone being taken, which it will be. I know that too. Guest room has a printer. I'll get you a flash drive." Okay. She spent 3 hours at the kitchen table and then at Walt's ancient desktop, building the documentation package with the same structured discipline she'd used to write field incident reports. Sequenced chronologically, each piece of evidence cross-referenced, gaps noted and labeled as gaps rather than papered over. The lab report. The photographs of the pharmacy logs printed and annotated. A written account of each of the 3 patient deaths, time-stamped from memory, flagged for correlation. A summary of the secondary coding notation and her interpretation of what it matched in the federal classification system. The chain of custody for the vial, from her removal of it from the unit to its current location in a sealed evidence bag that was now in Walt's freezer. She also wrote in a separate document a clean account of her suspension, the meeting with Ford, what was said, the sequence of events leading to it. Not because it was the most important piece of the package, because it was the piece that demonstrated that she'd tried the internal channels first and what had happened when she had. She printed everything twice. One copy went into a sealed envelope addressed to Marcus Feld at a P.O. box she had memorized. The second copy she sealed in a separate envelope with instructions she wrote in Walt's kitchen in the event that she went unreachable for more than 72 hours. "That goes to the address on the back if you don't hear from me," she told Walt. He took it without comment and put it in the fireproof lockbox under his desk. He'd had a lockbox like that under every desk he'd ever worked at. Some habits were foundational. Her phone buzzed. Not the prepaid, her personal phone, which she'd turned back on 40 minutes ago because going dark completely created its own signature, and because there were things she needed to see. The message was from Becca. No content, just a contact card shared through the hospital's internal communication app, which meant Becca had sent it from a hospital device. The contact listed was a Dr. Louis Ferris, the same resident who'd brushed Nora off the night Gerald Ostroff died. She stared at the message for a moment. Then she typed back, "Don't use hospital devices. Find a personal line and call me." She put the phone face down and looked at Walt. "I need to make one more call." "Use the landline," he said. "It's not on anything." Hossem, Marcus Feld answered on the second ring. He was a man she'd worked alongside briefly, years ago, during a period she still couldn't document in writing. 3 weeks in a context that had put both of them in situations where you either figured out fast whether you could trust the person next to you, or you didn't last long enough to figure out anything else. She'd concluded he was competent, pragmatic, and the kind of honest that wasn't about virtue, so much as about the long-term inefficiency of lying to people who were going to find out anyway. "I got your message," he said. "And I received the package just now. There's a courier. Walt." Efficient? A pause. "The compound notation. Walk me through what you matched it to." She did. He was quiet through it, and his quiet had a texture to it. Not absence of response, but the compression of someone processing fast. When she finished, he said, "That research line was supposed to be archived. The principal investigators team was disbanded 4 years ago when the program lost DoD funding." "Supposed to be." "Yes." Another pause. "Supposed to be. I need to know if there are other hospitals. You think Vandermeer isn't the only site. The compound is in a federal research classification. The methodology is too structured for a single-site improvisation. Someone stood this up. That takes time and infrastructure and more than one location to be useful as a data collection system." Feld was quiet for 5 seconds. That was a long time for him. "Give me 24 hours. I don't know if I have 24 hours before they start covering tracks." "I know. Give me 24 hours anyway." She hung up and stood in Walt's kitchen for a moment with the landline handset still in her hand, looking out the window at the gray-green scrubland and the power lines and the nothing much that was everywhere out here, which was the point of being out here. Her personal phone buzzed. A number she didn't recognize. Local Oregon area code, not a hospital exchange. She answered it. "It's Ferris." The young resident's voice, lower than she remembered it, in the hospital. Careful. "Louis Ferris. Becca gave me your number." "I know who you are. I have to tell you something." He stopped, started again. "I brushed you off. After Ostroff. You were right, and I brushed you off, and I should have listened." She kept her voice even. "What changed?" "Salter pulled me into his office this morning. He told me that you'd been suspended for spreading clinical misinformation and accessing restricted systems. He told me that if I'd had any conversations with you about patient outcomes, I needed to document that and report it to administration." A beat. He was very calm about it. That was the thing. Very calm. And I pulled Ostroff's chart last night before the call. Not his public record. I mean, I went to the physical archive because the electronic version had a notation error I wanted to check. The paper chart and the electronic chart don't match. The medication administration timing is different. The paper version shows a medication administration that isn't in the electronic record. His voice had the quality of someone working hard to stay level. Nora, someone edited the electronic chart. She'd expected this. She'd suspected it since the first death. But hearing it said out loud by someone with chart access and clinical credibility had a different weight from suspicion. Do you have the paper chart? I photographed it. I don't have the original, so it's in the archive. If they find out I was in there, send me the photographs. Same number you called. If Salter finds out, don't go back into the archive. Send me the photographs and then act normal, completely normal. Rounds, documentation, everything exactly as you do it on any other day. Yeah, he exhaled. Okay, yeah. Ferris. She kept her voice flat and direct because what he needed right now was not reassurance. It was instruction. You didn't do anything wrong. Send me the photographs. He hung up. The photographs arrived 4 minutes later. She looked at them on her phone screen, enlarging section by section. The discrepancy was exactly what he'd described. A medication administration logged in the paper record at 1:47 a.m. on the night of Ostrov's death, a full hour before his deterioration began, that had been removed entirely from the electronic chart. No correction notation, no override documentation, just gone. Someone with elevated access to the hospital's electronic medical record system had gone into Ostrov's chart and deleted an entry. That was not a nurse acting alone. That was not a single physician with a rogue research agenda. That was institutional infrastructure. She forwarded the photographs to Feld's secure line with one line of text. Chart alteration confirmed. Electronic versus paper discrepancy. Ostrov case. Then she sat down at Walt's kitchen table and ate the sandwich he'd left on the counter without tasting it, because she needed to eat, and she knew she wouldn't remember to later. By midday, things at Vandermeer Medical Center were moving in the particular way that institutions moved when they understood something had cracked, but hadn't yet determined the extent of the damage. Forday had called an emergency meeting of his senior administrative team at 9 a.m. Himself, the CFO, the chief compliance officer, and Dr. Victor Salter, who sat at the conference table with the expression of a man who had spent the prior 30 years being the most important person in any room he entered and was now recalibrating in real time. What exactly does she have, the CFO, a precise woman named Renata Ose, asked. She had the quality of someone who was already 3 steps ahead of the emotional component of the situation and working purely on exposure management. Pharmacy log photographs. Possibly the compound sample. Ford kept his voice controlled. She accessed the delivery records through the charge nurse's credentials. We know the timestamp of the session. What did she see? The secondary delivery coding, the rotation schedule. Salter shifted in his chair. If she's matched the coding, she's already matched it, Ford said. She's not accessing those records to confirm a hunch. She's accessing them to document what she already knows. Renata Ose looked at the table for a moment. What's our exposure window? Torrance is being briefed now. He meant Sylvia Torrance at Helix Corp. They're activating their own response protocol. What does that mean? It means we're not the only people managing this. Salter's jaw tightened. He'd been told, when he'd been brought into the program 18 months ago, that the administrative layer above him had everything structured, clean, deniable at every level below the top. He'd been told that the patient selection criteria were tight enough that outcomes would read as natural. He'd been told that the documentation systems had redundancies. He'd been told a lot of things that were apparently somewhat less solid than advertised, given that a night shift nurse had identified the pattern in 11 days. She was a night shift nurse, he said. It came out as something between a statement and an accusation. Ford looked at him. Her employment history prior to Vandermeer, we're still pulling the full record. What we have so far is incomplete. Incomplete how? The federal service period is partially redacted. The conference room was quiet for a moment. Partially redacted, Renata Ose repeated. Yes. Salter stared at the table. He was 61 years old, and he had made, over the course of a career, a sequence of decisions that each individually had seemed containable. He understood, sitting in this room, that the cumulative geometry of those decisions had produced a situation that was considerably less containable than any of them had appeared at the time. "I need to know what she sent and to whom," he said, "before anything else. I need to know who she's talking to." "We're working on it," Ford said. But the working on it was already behind the timeline that mattered, and everyone in the room knew it, even if no one said it. Becca left work at the end of her shift at 3 p.m. and drove to a coffee shop 4 miles from the hospital and sat in the back corner with her phone and called Nora from her personal line. "There's something else," she said. "I probably should have told you earlier, but I didn't know if it was relevant." Nora was in the car, heading back toward Caldwell Falls on a route she'd chosen specifically because it didn't pass the hospital. "Tell me now. About 3 months ago, a man came onto the floor. Not a patient, not a physician. He had an administrative badge, but I didn't recognize him. He spent about 20 minutes in the medication room with Salter. I wasn't supposed to notice, but I was charting in the alcove and the door was half open." She paused. "He had a case with him, black, hard shell, like a sample case." "Did you see the badge name?" "Partial. It started with T. The hospital logo was on the badge, but the secondary logo... There was a secondary logo I didn't recognize, a helix shape, like a spiral." Nora processed this in the 3 seconds before she responded. "Did anyone else see him?" "I asked around after. 2 other nurses saw him on different floors, same badge, same case. One of them said he came in on a Tuesday, and she remembered because it was the same day we got the new pharmacy rotation schedule." She stopped. "That's when the notation I told you about started showing up on the delivery confirmations. 3 months ago." Which meant the program had been running for at least a quarter before the first death Nora had identified. Which meant there might be deaths she hadn't identified. Patients whose outcomes she hadn't been present for, hadn't been close enough to flag. She thought about that for a moment and felt the particular cold that came from understanding that the perimeter of what you'd been trying to solve was larger than you'd been working. "Becca, I need you to pull the mortality records for your unit going back 6 months, not the full charts, just the names, dates, and admission diagnoses. You can access that through the shift summary reports without triggering a records alert." I'd have to do it from a personal device on hospital Wi-Fi. That still shows a login." "Log in as yourself. It's your normal work access. You're reviewing shift documentation. There's nothing unusual about that." A pause. "What am I looking for?" "Patients matching a specific profile. Admitted for non-terminal conditions. Died unexpectedly after day 3 of admission. I'll give you the demographic parameters." She gave Becca the parameters. Age range, admission diagnosis categories, day of death window. It was specific enough to filter down and general enough not to be immediately obvious if the log access was reviewed. "Send it to my personal email," Nora said, "not the hospital system." "Okay." A breath. "Nora, how bad is this?" She kept her eyes on the road. "Pull the records and send them to me." She didn't answer the question because the answer wasn't one she wanted to give Becca over the phone. The answer was, "It's bad enough that 3 patients we know about are dead, and I don't yet know how many we don't know about, and the people responsible have been operating inside a functioning hospital with institutional cover and external funding from a corporation with enough reach to obtain compounds from a discontinued federal research program." The answer was, "Worse than you want it to be," but she kept that to herself. By evening, she was back in Caldwell Falls, parked 2 blocks from her apartment building in a spot that gave her a sight line to the entrance. She'd been trained not to go straight back to the place where you lived when you had reason to think someone might have an interest in your movements. She sat in the car and watched her building for 20 minutes. Nothing flagged. She went in. She packed a bag. 2 days of clothing, her backup documentation set. The prepaid phone, cash she kept in a fireproof box in the closet. The original flash drive with everything she'd compiled at Waltz. She was out in 11 minutes. She drove to a motel on the highway north of the city that took cash and didn't look at faces. She paid for 2 nights, went to the room, and sat on the edge of the bed and finally allowed herself to feel the weight of the day for approximately 3 minutes before she put it down again, because feeling the weight was not the same as being crushed by it, and she'd learned long ago that you could acknowledge what a thing cost you without letting the cost stop you. Her personal phone showed a missed call from a number she didn't recognize. Different area code, not Oregon. She called it back. Ms. Callahan. Female voice, precise. My name is Agent Dana Rourke. I work with a federal task force that operates under joint DOJ and HHS oversight. I was contacted this afternoon by a colleague of yours. I've reviewed the preliminary documentation package. A pause. I'd like to meet with you tomorrow morning. Where? Somewhere of your choosing. I'll text you an address. Understood. I need to tell you, and I'm being direct because I think you'll prefer that. The compound identification in your lab report triggered a flag in a system I don't have full visibility into yet. What I can tell you is that the flag suggests this isn't the first time this compound has surfaced in a civilian medical context. Nora was very still. How many times? That's what I'm trying to determine. What I know right now is that your case appears to be one data point in something larger. Another pause, this one with more weight to it. I want you to understand what you may have walked into. I understand what I walked into, Nora said. A beat. All right, tomorrow morning. She put the phone down and sat in the motel room with the thin curtains and the hum of the highway outside, and thought about what Rourke had said. One data point in something larger. She'd suspected this since the compound classification had registered. She'd built the suspicion into her documentation, but suspecting and being told by a federal agent were different in a way that wasn't about the information itself. It was about the velocity of what came next. Tomorrow would be different from today. Today had been about gathering and running and building the case. Tomorrow would be the beginning of the case actually moving. And once something like this started moving at a federal level, the people it was moving toward would feel the pressure and they would act. That meant the window for anything done quietly was closing. She thought about Damon Ford in his office on the third floor with his awards and his controlled expression. She thought about Victor Salter on morning rounds, efficient and dismissive. She thought about Sylvia Torrance, whose voice she'd never heard, but whose name now sat in her documentation package as the Helix Corp contact she'd reconstructed from the call logs that Ferris had photographed from Salter's desk. Ferris had sent those an hour ago with a message that said simply, "Found these during a chart review. I think you need them." She thought about all of it, and then she set it aside and lay down on the motel bed with her shoes on and her phone on her chest, because she needed at least 4 hours of sleep, and she was going to take them before the morning changed everything. She was asleep in 6 minutes. It wasn't peaceful sleep, but it was sleep, and her body had learned not to be selective about it. Her phone buzzed at 11:47 p.m. The message was from Becca. It contained a list of names and dates pulled from the shift summary records, formatted cleanly. Becca was methodical, which Nora had noted and appreciated. She'd pulled 6 months of data as instructed and filtered it through the parameters Nora had given her. Nora sat up and turned on the lamp and read through the list. The 3 names she already knew were there: Ostroff, Webb, Gund. Below them, going further back, were 4 more names she didn't. 7 total. 7 patients. 3 she'd been present for. 4 who had died before she'd started watching. Before she'd identified the pattern. Before she'd known there was a pattern to identify. She sat on the edge of the bed in the motel room with the highway humming outside and looked at those 4 names for a long time. People who had come into Vandermeer Medical Center with conditions that should not have killed them. People who had died in a window she hadn't been watching. She forwarded the list to Feld and to the number Rourke had called from with a single line of text. 7 confirmed, not 3. Documentation attached. Then she put the phone down and pressed her palms flat against her thighs and breathed through it. The weight of 7 names. The specific weight of the 4 she hadn't been there for. The weight of the system that had produced this and the administrative architecture that had contained it, and the people who had built that architecture out of a hospital that was supposed to be keeping people alive. She breathed through it. She put it down. She turned off the lamp. In the morning, she would meet Rourke, and the thing would begin moving at a velocity that couldn't be stopped once it started. That was what needed to happen. That was the only direction this could go that meant the 7 names meant something beyond what had been done to them. She lay back down in the dark. At the other end of the city, in a black car parked outside her now empty apartment building, a man in dark clothing looked at a phone screen that showed a live feed from a tracking application that was returning no signal. He made a call. "She's not there," he said. "The phone's dark." On the other end, a silence. Then, "Find the nurse." and find out who she's been talking to. The man in the black car sat outside Nora's empty apartment until 2 a.m. and then left, which meant whoever had sent him had decided that waiting was less useful than moving. Nora didn't know this yet. She was asleep in the motel room with her shoes on and her phone on her chest, and the 4 hours she'd allocated to sleep stretched to 5 because her body made an executive decision that overrode the alarm she'd set, and she woke at 6:14 with a specific disorientation that lasted exactly 2 seconds before everything came back in sequence and she was already sitting up before she was fully conscious. She checked her phone. 3 messages from Feld, sent between midnight and 5 a.m. She read them in order. The first said, 7 confirmed, cross-referencing now against 2 other sites. The second, sent at 2:31 a.m. 2 additional facilities showing similar mortality anomalies. Different states. Same compound signature and archived samples from a DOJ case that was closed 14 months ago, closed incorrectly. Someone buried it. The third, sent at 4:58 a.m., was 4 words. This goes higher. Careful. She sat with those 4 words for a moment. Then she got up, washed her face, and texted Rourke the address of a diner 6 blocks from the motel. Dana Rourke was already there when Nora arrived at 7:30. She was in her mid-40s, with short, gray-streaked hair and the kind of posture that came from years of sitting in rooms where you couldn't afford to look uncertain. She was drinking black coffee and had a folder on the table in front of her that she closed when Nora sat down, which meant the folder contained something she wasn't ready to open with yet. They looked at each other for a moment in the way that 2 people who had each decided independently to trust the other provisionally did, assessing, calibrating, not performing warmth they didn't have. "You saw my message last night," Nora said. 7 patients, yes. Rourke turned her coffee cup. "I need to tell you something before we go further because it affects how you understand what you've walked into and what my limitations are." She paused. 14 months ago, a DOJ investigator named Patrick Seo opened a preliminary inquiry into anomalous mortality patterns at a hospital in Nevada. He identified a compound in 2 archived patient samples. He submitted a classification inquiry and was told the compound was unrelated to any active federal program. Decommissioned research, no current applicability. The inquiry was closed. Closed by whom? That's what I'm trying to determine. The closure notation has a case number that routes to a division I don't have direct access to. She held Nora's gaze. Seo retired 4 months after the closure. Early retirement. He was 51. Nora said nothing. "I'm not suggesting anything definitive," Rourke said. "I'm telling you the shape of what I can see from where I'm standing, which is not the top of this." She opened the folder. "What I can act on is Vandermeer. What you've documented is sufficient for a federal search warrant. I filed the application this morning at 6 a.m. I have a judge who will turn it around in 4 hours if I ask her to. 4 hours is a long time if they're already moving. I know, that's why I also called the Oregon State Health Authority at 5:45 and initiated an emergency patient safety review, which gives us grounds to place an immediate administrative hold on the hospital's medication dispensing system pending inspection. That's a separate lever from the criminal warrant, and it moves faster." She turned a page in the folder. "The hold goes into effect at 9 a.m. Nora looked at her. "That will tell them exactly how far along we are." "Yes. It will also prevent any further compound administrations while the warrant processes." A pause. "I made a call. 7 patients are dead. I chose the lever that stops the immediate harm." It was the right call. Nora would have made the same one. She didn't say that. It didn't need to be said. But something in her posture shifted fractionally, a recalibration of the provisional trust into something slightly more durable. "What do you need from me?" Nora asked. "I need you on record. Formal statement today, before the warrant executes. Your account is the chain of custody for the physical evidence and the origin documentation. Without your formal statement, the evidence package has gaps that a good defense attorney will drive a vehicle through." "I understand. I also need you to understand that once your name is on that statement, it becomes discoverable. Everyone involved in this will know who you are and what you documented." "They already know who I am," Nora said. "Someone was outside my apartment last night." Rourke's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. "Did you make contact?" "No, I wasn't there." How did you know? I didn't go home. Rourke looked at her for a moment longer than the answer strictly required. All right, she said. Then, I'd like to understand your background a little better before we proceed. The federal service period in your employment record is partially redacted, Nora said. I know? What can you tell me? Enough to confirm that I know what that compound classification means and why it should not be in a civilian hospital. Enough to confirm that my identification of it is not a guess. She held Rourke's gaze. The specific program context I can't give you, but if your inquiry routes to the right division, the clearance structure will confirm my credibility without requiring me to detail the work. Rourke wrote something on the margin of her folder. I'll make that call this morning. She looked up. One more thing, the name Helix Corp. You included it in your documentation. From Salter's call logs, photographed by a source inside the hospital. The source's name? I'd like to protect that until the warrant executes. A pause. Fair. She closed the folder. I need that statement in the next 2 hours. Can you come to the field office? Yes. They left the diner without finishing their coffee. The morning outside was cold and overcast. The particular low gray of Oregon in autumn that pressed down on everything with a kind of steady indifference. Nora walked to her car and sat in it for 30 seconds before starting it, running through the sequence of what was about to happen the way she used to run through extraction routes. Entry point, action, contingency, exit, the warrant, the medication hold, her formal statement placing her name on the record. And then, at some point in the next 12 to 24 hours, the moment when Vandermeer Medical Center stopped being a building where things were being concealed and became a building where things were being uncovered. She started the car and drove. At 8:47 a.m., 13 minutes before the Oregon State Health Authority's administrative hold went into effect, Damon Ford received a call from Sylvia Torrance. Activate the contingency, she said. No preamble. Full document protocol. Today. He was in his office, standing. He'd been standing since 7 a.m. because sitting felt like the wrong posture for what the past 18 hours had felt like. The hold hasn't... It will. Our monitoring picked up the OSHA filing at 6 this morning. Her voice was its usual affectless precision, but there was a velocity underneath it now that he hadn't heard before. The state hold is administrative. What comes behind it won't be. You have a window. Use it. Torrance. He kept his voice steady by effort. If we activate document protocol, that's what the protocol exists for. Activate it. She hung up. He stood for a moment with the phone in his hand. Document protocol meant the secondary server, the one that ran parallel to the hospital's main EMR system, the one that held the actual compound administration records, the real medication logs, the patient selection matrices, the correspondence with Helix Corp. It meant initiating a deletion sequence that would take those records off the secondary server and route them to a remote offsite archive that existed outside any system the hospital's IT infrastructure could be compelled to produce. It also meant that if someone had already imaged the secondary server, the deletion would show as a gap, a visible act of destruction rather than a clean absence. He knew this. He'd raised it with Torrance 4 months ago when they'd first set up the contingency, and she'd told him that a visible gap was better than present evidence. He'd accepted that reasoning at the time. In the abstract, it had sounded clean. He called his IT director. He used the phrase they'd established 14 months ago for exactly this scenario. The IT director, a man named Garrett, who knew exactly what the phrase meant and had spent 14 months hoping he would never hear it, acknowledged and disconnected. At 9:02 a.m., the document deletion sequence initiated. At 9:04 a.m., the Oregon State Health Authority administrative hold went into effect, freezing the hospital's medication dispensing system. At 9:11 a.m., a federal monitoring system that Rourke had quietly attached to Vandermeer's server infrastructure the night before, attached with the authorization of a federal judge who'd been briefed on the case at 11 p.m., flagged the deletion sequence and automatically imaged the secondary server in its current state before the deletion completed. The deletion got 63% of the records. The imaging got the rest. Rourke's phone showed the alert at 9:12 a.m. She was sitting across from Nora in the federal field office conference room, watching Nora work through the formal statement. She looked at her phone screen. She said it face down without changing her expression. "Keep going," she said. Heat. Nora was halfway through the statement when her personal phone, set to silent on the table beside her, lit up with Becca's number. She looked at Rourke. "Take it," Rourke said. She answered. "Becca, something's happening." Becca's voice was tight, controlled in the way of someone who was scared and not letting themselves be. "Salter just pulled 4 patients from the floor. 3 of them are on the profile you gave me. He's transferring them to private rooms in the East Wing. That wing was closed for renovation 2 months ago. There shouldn't be anyone in there." Nora felt the cold move through her chest. "Are the patients ambulatory?" "2 of them, yes. 1 is a wheelchair transfer. The 4th, I don't know his profile. I haven't pulled his chart." "Are the transfers documented?" "That's the thing. The transfer orders are in the system, but they're time-stamped 40 minutes ago, before Salter even arrived on the floor this morning. Predated orders. Someone had staged the documentation before the physical transfers happened, which meant the transfers had been planned before the morning shift, before the medication hold, before whatever Ford had activated, before the day had even begun. Which meant someone had known last night that today was the day things would change, and had moved in advance. "Don't interfere with the transfers," Nora said. "Note everything. Times, room numbers, who's present. Text it to this number. Don't go to the East Wing." "Nora, don't go. Text me." She hung up and looked at Rourke. "They're moving patients. East Wing, closed section. I think they're not just covering documents." Rourke was already standing. "You think they're removing the evidence that's still breathing?" "I think it's possible." Rourke picked up her phone and made a call that lasted 45 seconds. When she hung up, she said, "Federal marshals are 8 minutes out. I'm calling the warrant judge for emergency authorization to enter the facility." She looked at Nora with the directness of someone who'd had to make fast decisions in bad situations before. "I need you to finish this statement in the next 5 minutes. I need it on record before we go in." Nora picked up the pen and finished it in 4. The East Wing of Vandermeer Medical Center was a corridor of 12 rooms that had been officially closed for renovation since August, a fact that was documented in the facility's management log and had been mentioned in the board meeting minutes as a cost management measure. The renovation had not, in fact, begun. The rooms were clean and functional and had been quietly maintained with working medical equipment because certain contingencies required a location that was technically closed and therefore not subject to routine nursing rounds or patient census reporting. Salter stood in the corridor of the East Wing at 9:34 a.m. and looked at the 4 patients who had been transferred to rooms 7 through 10 with the expression of a man who had been telling himself for 18 months that he could see the architecture of this situation clearly and was now revising that assessment in real time. He hadn't ordered the transfers. He'd been called by Ford 40 minutes ago and told the transfers were happening and to be present. He was present. He didn't entirely know why. One of the patients, a 63-year-old woman named Dolores, admitted 6 days ago for a respiratory infection, was sitting up in the bed in room 7, looking at him with the particular alertness of a person who knows something is wrong with their situation and hasn't yet decided what to do about it. "Why was I moved?" she asked. "Precautionary measure," Salter said. "Your room is needed for an incoming case." She looked at him for a moment. "The renovation wing?" "Temporary accommodation." She said nothing more, but she didn't look away from him, and there was something in that sustained look, not accusation, not fear, just sustained attention, that he found more difficult to absorb than anger would have been. He walked back into the corridor. His phone showed a message from Ford. "Compound on schedule. East Wing only." He read it twice. He put the phone in his pocket. He stood in the corridor of the closed East Wing with the working equipment and the 4 transferred patients and the message on his phone and felt, with a specificity that he hadn't anticipated, the full weight of 18 months of incremental decisions arrive at once. A compound on schedule. East Wing only. Meaning the medication hold that was now in effect on the main hospital floors did not cover the East Wing, because the East Wing was not in the active patient census system. He'd known about the research program. He'd known about the patient selection. He told himself, with the particular motivated reasoning of someone who needed to believe their own story, that he was a peripheral actor, that he'd raised concerns internally, that he'd been assured the compound had acceptable safety parameters, that his role was clinical oversight, not clinical authorization. He'd told himself he was managing a bad situation from the inside, doing less harm than would occur without his presence. He was standing in a closed corridor with 4 transferred patients and a message on his phone about a compound on schedule. The story he'd been telling himself didn't hold anymore. It hadn't been holding for a while. He'd just been choosing not to look directly at that. He took his phone out again. He opened a new message. He typed a name. Not Ford's, not Torrance's. A name he'd stored for exactly the moment when he ran out of story to tell himself. He sent it before he could make another decision in a sequence of decisions that had taken him here. Nora heard the first set of sirens as Rourke's car turned onto the street that ran alongside Vandermeer's east face. 2 federal marshal vehicles were already in the main entrance loop. A third was on the side road. Rourke had coordinated on the phone from the field office with the efficiency of someone who did this for a living and understood that the window between a warrant executing and evidence disappearing was measured in minutes. They went through the main entrance with credentials out. The lobby security officer looked at the federal identification, looked at the marshals coming in behind them, and stepped back without asking any of the questions he might otherwise have asked. The nursing station on the main floor was the controlled chaos of a facility whose medication dispensing system had been frozen mid-shift. Nurses trying to get manual override authorizations, a resident attempting to reach pharmacy, a charge nurse on hold with the state authority. Nora scanned the floor in the 2 seconds she had as they moved through, cataloging. Nothing immediately dangerous, nothing requiring intervention right now, patient stable. They took the east stairwell because the east stairwell accessed the closed wing directly. Rourke pushed through the door at the corridor level, and they came into the east wing, and Salter was standing there, alone, in the middle of the hallway. He looked at Nora. She looked at him. Whatever she'd expected from this moment, anger, denial, the kind of institutional deflection he'd delivered on the morning rounds, wasn't what she saw. What she saw was a man who had arrived somewhere he'd been walking toward for a long time and was finally standing still. "There are 4 patients in rooms 7 through 10, he said. His voice was flat. The performance had gone out of it entirely. "They were transferred this morning under my name. I didn't order the transfers." He looked at Rourke. "The orders were predated. I have the original on my phone. Ford sent it to me at 7:52 a.m. The system timestamp on the order reads 7:13. Rourke looked at him for a moment. "Step aside, doctor." He stepped aside. The federal marshals moved into the rooms. Nora followed, going room to room. 4 patients, vital signs checked by hands and by eye before the equipment could be interrogated, each patient's IV access assessed for current infusion status. Room 7, clear. Room 8, clear. Room 9, she stopped. The patient in room 9 was a 58-year-old man, heavy set, admitted 4 days ago. His IV line was running. The fluid bag above him had a label she recognized. The slight font variance, the non-standard format. She looked at the bag and then at the patient's face and saw the beginning of something in his color that she'd seen 3 times before, and then 2 more times in Becca's mortality list, names and dates on a phone screen in a motel room. She disconnected the IV line in one motion and reached across the bed for the call button and held it down and looked at the patient, who was conscious and looking back at her with confusion edging toward alarm. "What's happening?" he said. "We're stopping something," she said. "You're going to be okay." It was the first time she'd said those words since she'd said them to Gerald Ostroff, who hadn't been okay. She said them now because they were true, because she'd gotten here in time, because the 4 hours of sleep and the cold coffee and the 11 days of watching and the photograph of a lab report folded in a jacket pocket and the drive to Walt's house and the documentation built on a kitchen table had added up to this moment in this room, and the man in the bed was going to be okay. A marshal appeared in the doorway. "We need to clear room 10. "Go," she said. "I've got this one." She stayed with the patient in room 9 while the marshal moved on, one hand on the disconnected IV line, her eyes tracking his face for color and responsiveness while she listened to the corridor, the sound of the facility shifting on its axis, the sound of things that had been running in the dark being dragged into the light. From somewhere down the corridor she heard Rourke's voice, controlled and precise, reading rights to someone. She didn't look. She kept her eyes on the patient in front of her because that was the job. "Was," Damon Ford was not in the building. He'd left at 9:20 a.m., 13 minutes after the deletion sequence initiated, 11 minutes before the federal marshals arrived. His assistant had called the board chairman at 9:21, claiming Ford had a medical appointment. His parking space was empty when Rourke's team checked it at 9:33. He'd taken his personal vehicle. He'd left his hospital-issued phone on his desk, powered off, which was either discipline or panic, or both. Rourke put his description and plate number through federal channels at 9:40. Border alerts. Airport flagging. The standard net that went out fast and covered a lot of ground but wasn't instant. She told Nora this in the East Wing corridor at 9:52 after the 4 patients had been assessed, after the IV bags from rooms 9 and 10 had been bagged as evidence, after Salter had been placed in a room with 2 marshals and a recorder and was talking, steadily, without a lawyer present, which was either guilt or calculation or both. "He's running," Nora said. "He doesn't have anywhere to go that we can't follow," Rourke said. "He knows that." "Yes. So he's buying time, or he's going somewhere specific." Rourke looked at her. "Somewhere that matters to him more than the alternatives." Nora thought about the Helix Corp logo on a hospital badge. A man with a black hard-shell case on a Tuesday 3 months ago. A compound pulled from a discontinued federal research program that someone had decided wasn't done being useful. The money that required, the infrastructure, the reach. "He's not the top," she said. "He said as much to his CFO yesterday morning. He's a node. He goes somewhere specific. He goes to whoever is above him, or whoever he thinks can protect him." "Is there a difference?" Rourke didn't answer that because the answer was no, and they both knew it. Nora's phone buzzed. Ferris, Louis Ferris, the resident, calling from his personal number. She answered it. His voice was wrong. Not scared in the calibrated way Becca had been scared, doing the work while holding the fear at a distance. Wrong in a different way, compressed, urgent, with an edge of something that she'd heard in people who had just witnessed something they weren't equipped for. "Nora, Salter's office. Someone was just in there. I saw them leaving, 2 people. They had bags, equipment bags, like they were pulling something. I followed them because I didn't know what else to do, and they went to the parking structure, and there was a car running, and they put the bags in, and Nora, one of them had a laptop. I could see the logo on it, and the other one, Ferris." She cut through it, not unkindly. "Are you still in the parking structure?" "Yes." "What level?" 3, southwest corner." "Stay on the phone. Don't approach them." She looked at Rourke. "Parking structure, level 3. Someone's pulling equipment from Salter's office." Rourke was already moving, already calling it in, and Nora was moving with her because the building was in motion now. Everything was in motion. The machinery of concealment reversing direction under pressure, in the particular violent way that things reversed when the pressure had been building for a long time. From the stairwell, Nora heard the echo of the structure's concrete floors and the distant sound of a car engine. And she thought about Damon Ford on the road somewhere, and the secondary server that had been 63% deleted, and Sylvia Torrance in an office somewhere running her own containment protocol. And she understood with the clarity that came from having studied systems under pressure that what was happening right now was not an ending. It was the moment before things got harder. She pushed through the stairwell door onto level 3 and saw, 30 meters ahead, a car with its engine running and 2 figures loading the trunk, and one of those figures turning at the sound of the door and seeing her and making the calculation in the same second she was making hers. The figure dropped the bag, reached into their jacket, and ran, not toward her, away from her, toward the structure's open side, the ramp that led to level 4, the upper open deck with its 360 sightlines and its single exit onto the street. Nora ran. She covered the 30 meters in less time than it took the figure to get to the ramp, and she was faster than them by a margin that had nothing to do with current fitness and everything to do with how she'd spent 6 years and what her body still remembered. And she had them at the base of the ramp with one hand on their collar and their momentum used against them and them face down on the concrete before they'd gotten another 10 meters. They were a man in his 30s with a Helix Corp badge clipped to his lapel. He was breathing hard. She had one knee on his back, one hand on his wrist in a grip that made movement expensive. "Don't," she said. One word. Flat. He stopped moving. Behind her, she heard Rourke's footsteps, and then a marshal's, and then the sounds of the second figure being secured near the car. She heard Ferris's voice somewhere, still on the phone she'd put in her jacket pocket, saying her name. She heard the building around her, the hospital, 6 floors of glass and concrete, all the ordinary sounds of a place that was supposed to be for healing. She held the man on the ground and waited for the marshal and thought about Gerald Ostroff and his phone calls to his daughter, and Marcus Webb, who'd laughed at her terrible sense of humor, and Patricia Gund, who'd had opinions about everything, and the 4 names she hadn't known until Becca sent them in a list at 11:47 p.m., and the man in room 9 whose IV she'd disconnected and who was going to be okay. 7 names, maybe more, in Nevada, maybe more in the other states Feld had flagged. The marshal arrived. She transferred custody, stood up, and looked at Rourke, who had followed her and was standing 5 feet away with the particular expression of someone reassessing a variable they hadn't fully accounted for. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Rourke's phone rang, and she answered it, and her expression changed. "When?" she said. A pause. "How many?" Another pause. Longer this time. She looked at Nora. The expression on her face was not the controlled affect of a federal agent managing information. It was the unguarded look of someone who had just been told that the problem they were solving was considerably larger than the room they were standing in. "What is it?" Nora said. Rourke lowered the phone. Feld's team just flagged a 3rd facility. Not Oregon, not Nevada. She paused. Montana. A different hospital, different physician staff, same compound signature, same patient profile. Nora said nothing. "And there's a 4th flag in Colorado that's still preliminary." Rourke looked at her steadily. "Nora, this isn't a rogue program that survived a budget cut. This is a network, active, running right now in multiple states under the same operational structure. The parking structure was cold and smelled like concrete and engine exhaust, and the particular stillness of a place where something significant had just stopped moving in one direction and hadn't started moving in another yet." "Helix Corp," Nora said. "Yes." "Torrance." "Yes." Nora looked at the Helix Corp badge on the man still face down on the ground, and at the equipment bags in the open trunk of the car, and at the 6 floors of glass and concrete above her, and then out at the gray Oregon morning beyond the open side of the structure. "Then Ford isn't running to protection," she said. "He's running to the source." Rourke's phone rang again. She looked at the screen. Her jaw tightened. A small movement, controlled, but Nora caught it. "What?" Nora said. Rourke answered the call, listened for 8 seconds, and then said, "Lock it down." She hung up and looked at Nora with the directness of someone who had decided that the situation required complete honesty, regardless of what it cost both of them. Ford's car was just found at the regional airport. He boarded a private charter 40 minutes ago. She paused. The charter's registration traces to a subsidiary of Helix Corp. Flight plan filed for a private airstrip outside Portland. Another pause. Feld flagged the destination 20 minutes ago. That airstrip is adjacent to a facility that Helix Corp has held under a shell company for 3 years. What kind of facility? Officially? A pharmaceutical research campus. Nora looked at her. "We're getting Federal Aviation Authority to ground further departures from that strip," Rourke said. "We have a team moving toward the facility now, but Ford is already on the ground, and whoever is in that building knows we're coming because Ford just walked in the door and told them." The cold Oregon air moved through the open side of the parking structure. Somewhere in the hospital above them, a patient call light blinked on and a nurse answered it, because the work continued regardless, because it always did. Nora looked at the Helix Corp badge. She looked at Rourke. "The facility in Portland," she said. "Is that where Torrance operates?" Rourke held her gaze. "According to Feld's preliminary data, yes. That facility is Helix Corp's primary domestic research site. Whatever the compound is, whatever program it came from, whatever the full scope of what we're looking at is..." She stopped. "That's where it lives." Nora had been suspended from her job. She had been watched and tracked and outmaneuvered at every official channel. She had driven to a stranger's farm and built a case on a kitchen table. She had given a statement that put her name on a federal record. She had disconnected an IV line and held a man down on a parking structure floor and felt, throughout all of it, the specific quality of someone doing what was necessary without the comfort of certainty about how it would end. She was not a federal agent. She did not have a badge or a warrant. What she had was a documentation package that had started a federal investigation, a compound sample in Walt's freezer, and 11 days of pattern recognition that had led to this moment. She looked at Rourke. "I want to be there," she said. Rourke looked back at her for a long moment. "I know," she said. She didn't say yes, she didn't say no. Her phone rang a third time. She looked at the screen, and this time what crossed her face was something Nora hadn't seen from her before. Not alarm, not the controlled adjustment of a professional absorbing bad information. Something closer to the expression of a person who has just been handed a piece of information that changes the shape of everything they thought they understood. She turned slightly away from Nora when she answered it. She listened for 40 seconds without speaking. Then she said very quietly, "Are you certain?" A pause. "Get me a confirmation from the second source before you move on that." She hung up. She stood with her back partially turned for 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. The length of time it took a person to decide how to deliver something. Then she turned around. "The DOJ investigator," she said. "Patrick Seo. The one who closed the Nevada inquiry 14 months ago and retired at 51. She stopped. "He didn't retire voluntarily." Nora was very still. "He's been in a private care facility in Washington state for 13 months. Admitted for what his family was told was a stress-induced neurological episode." Rourke's voice was level, but only by effort. "The admitting physician's affiliation, the private facility's primary funding source." "Helix Corp," Nora said. "Yes." The parking structure was very quiet. "They didn't just bury his inquiry," Nora said. "They buried him. That's what I'm looking at." Nora stood in the cold concrete space and felt the full weight of the things she had walked into. Not just Vandermeer, not just 7 patients, not just a rogue compound from a discontinued program. The weight of a system that had been protecting itself for longer than she'd known it existed, that had resources and reach, and the willingness to use both, that had taken a federal investigator and put him in a room somewhere and made him disappear from the record while his family was told it was stress. She breathed through it. She put it down. She looked at Rourke. "Then we don't wait," she said. Rourke looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who had, over the past 12 hours, revised their understanding of who Nora Callahan was several times, and was revising it again now. "No," she said. "We don't." She was already dialing. Rourke was on the phone for 4 minutes straight while Nora stood in the parking structure and watched the marshal secure the second Helix Corp operative near the car. The bags were already tagged as evidence. The hard-shell cases were open on the ground, laptops, external drives, a portable server unit that had no business being in a hospital employee's possession. Someone had built a secondary data infrastructure inside Vandermeer's physical plant, running parallel to the hospital's official systems, and had been prepared to walk it out the door the moment the pressure got too close. They'd been 40 minutes too slow. Rourke finished the call and turned around. Federal Aviation grounded all departures from the Portland airstrip 11 minutes ago. Ford is on the ground, but he's not going anywhere. She looked at the evidence bags. "I have a team at the Helix Corp facility in 40 minutes. I need to be on the road." "I know." "You should go somewhere safe and wait for—" "I'm coming with you." Rourke looked at her. The pause lasted exactly as long as it needed to. "You're a civilian. I'm the person who built the case that got you the warrant. I know the compound classification. I know the patient selection parameters. I know what to look for in a medical research facility that your team won't recognize on site." She held Rourke's gaze. "You can spend 20 minutes arguing with me, or you can have me in the car." Another pause. Shorter this time. "You ride with me," Rourke said. "You don't move without my authorization once we're on site. If I tell you to stop, you stop." Understood. They left the parking structure at 10:08 a.m. Behind them, Vandermeer Medical Center was in the controlled upheaval of a facility being simultaneously managed by its remaining staff and processed by federal agents. Patients being assessed, medications being verified manually, a charge nurse named Paulette running the floor with the focused calm of someone who understood that patients still needed care regardless of what was happening to the institution around them. Becca was there. Ferris was there. The work was continuing because it had to. Nora watched the building recede in the side mirror and felt the particular quality of leaving something unfinished. Not the investigation, which was moving now with a velocity that couldn't be stopped, but the patients. The floor. The work she'd been doing every night for 2 years and 3 months, that had nothing to do with compounds and concealment and everything to do with the ordinary, grinding, essential labor of keeping people alive. She turned back to face the road. The drive to Portland took 2 hours and 14 minutes. Rourke drove and made calls, and Nora sat in the passenger seat and read through the documents Feld had forwarded in the past hour. A growing picture of Helix Corp's structure assembled from corporate filings, federal contractor records, and the imaging data from Vandermeer's secondary server that had survived the deletion attempt. What the documents showed was not a pharmaceutical company that had gone rogue. It was a company that had been structured from inception around a specific purpose: the continuation of a research program that had lost federal authorization 4 years ago when the DoD had determined that its methodology crossed lines that the DoD, to its occasional credit, had lines about. The program had been designed to develop a compound capable of inducing targeted cardiovascular stress in selected subjects while producing a clinical presentation consistent with natural organ failure. The intended application, in its original DoD framing, was something Nora didn't need spelled out because she'd spent enough time adjacent to the world where those applications were considered. What Helix Corp had done was take that program private, strip out the federal oversight, replace the military application framing with a pharmaceutical research framing, and find hospitals, specifically hospitals with compliant administrative leadership and enough patient throughput that additional deaths would not produce statistical anomalies. The compound was being refined. The patients were the trials. 7 dead in Caldwell Falls, an unknown number in Nevada, in Montana, in Colorado. Patrick CO in a private care facility in Washington, put there because he'd gotten close enough to matter. An entire architecture of shell companies and research subsidiaries and corrupted administrators, built to look from the outside like a legitimate pharmaceutical enterprise, and from the inside like something that had no legitimate name. Nora read through it with the flat, methodical attention she gave to things that needed to be fully understood regardless of how they felt. She understood it. She filed it where it needed to go. "How long has Torrance been running this?" she asked. Rourke kept her eyes on the road. "Best current estimate is 4 years since the DoD program was archived." A pause. She was the program's deputy director when it was federally funded. When funding was pulled, she spent 6 months at a defense contractor and then founded Helix Corp. The principal investigator was her supervisor. He's been in a research position at a European university for 3 years. We're flagging him. He left the country when the program ended. Conveniently. Nora looked out the window at the highway. "Torrance didn't build this to sell a drug," she said. "The compound isn't going to market. There's no FDA pathway for what it does. So what's the end product?" Rourke was quiet for a moment. "The working theory from Feld's team is capability demonstration, proof of concept for a private client who wants to know the compound works at scale in uncontrolled civilian environments before committing to a larger acquisition. Someone is buying it. That's the theory. We don't have the buyer identified yet." Nora thought about that. A compound that could kill targeted individuals while producing presentations consistent with natural death. Tested in hospitals across multiple states, refined across dozens of subjects, sold to someone who needed proof it worked. She'd walked into Vandermeer 2 years ago to do direct patient care. She'd found her way to the edge of something that had no edges she could currently see. "What's Torrance's read on where she stands right now?" she asked. She doesn't know the extent of the server imaging yet. She knows we're moving on the facility. Ford would have told her that. She may think the documentation destruction was more complete than it was. Rourke paused. "Or she may be smarter than that." "She is smarter than that," Nora said. "She ran a covert research program for 4 years across multiple states without generating a single federal flag until an investigator happened to stumble onto it. She's not operating on the assumption that she's covered. She's operating on the assumption that she has a controlled amount of time to manage her exposure. Which means she's not running. She's deciding what to sacrifice." The Helix Corp facility outside Portland sat on 12 acres behind a perimeter fence, with corporate signage that was tasteful and uninformative. The visual language of a company that wanted to project legitimate enterprise without providing details. The main building was 3 stories of glass and gray stone, functional and clean, with a parking area that held 14 vehicles when the federal convoy pulled up at 12:23 p.m. Rourke had 4 federal agents, 2 forensic specialists, and authorization that covered every room in the building. She also had, in the passenger seat, a woman who was technically a suspended nurse and practically the most informed person on site about what they were looking for and why it mattered. The entry was not dramatic. It rarely was. A facility security officer came out, saw the credentials, made a call on his radio, and then stepped back because the credentials were sufficient, and the alternative to stepping back was a problem he wasn't paid enough to have. The front desk administrator inside was a young man who looked at the federal identification with the expression of someone who had just understood that their morning had taken a direction that their employment contract hadn't prepared them for. "I need to speak with Sylvia Torrance," Rourke said. "Ms. Torrance is in a meeting." "I know. Which room?" He told her. "Third floor, East Conference Room." Of course she was in a meeting. People like Torrance were always in a meeting when federal agents arrived, because being in a meeting created a procedural buffer. You were occupied, you were with others, there was a record of your location that wasn't the lobby where the agents were standing. Rourke took the stairs. Nora followed. 2 agents went ahead. 2 stayed on the ground floor to secure the exits. The third floor East Conference Room had a glass wall facing the corridor, which meant Torrance saw them coming. She was seated at the head of a table with 2 men in suits, lawyers from the posture, from the immediate movement toward their briefcases. And she looked up through the glass and saw Rourke, and then her eyes moved to the person behind Rourke, and she saw Nora. Something happened in Torrance's face in that moment. Not panic, not the performance of surprise. Something more specific. The expression of a person who has been running probability calculations for hours and has just had a variable resolve in a direction they'd assigned a low likelihood. She'd known about Nora. She'd known a nurse had taken a vial and sent it to a lab. She'd known a nurse had been suspended. She had not, apparently, fully weighted the possibility that the nurse was going to be standing on the other side of a glass wall, with a federal agent's warrant in the picture. Rourke opened the door. Torrance stood. She was 55, lean, with close-cropped silver hair, and the composed affect of someone who had spent decades being the smartest person in rooms that contained smart people. She was wearing a charcoal blazer and had a legal pad in front of her that was covered in handwriting Nora would have liked to read. "Agent Rourke," she said, "I've been expecting a conversation. I'd have appreciated a call first." "I'm sure." Rourke laid the warrant on the table. "This authorizes a full search of this facility and seizure of all research documentation, compound samples, communications, and financial records. I need you and your colleagues to step out of this room." One of the lawyers reached for the warrant. Rourke didn't stop him. She waited while he read it with the speed of someone who was looking for a technical objection and not finding one. "This is extremely broad," he said. "Yes," Rourke said. "It is." Torrance looked at the warrant. She looked at Rourke. Then she looked at Nora. Not quickly, not as an afterthought, but with the sustained attention of someone taking a full accounting of what was standing in front of them. "You're the nurse," she said. "From Vandermeer." "I'm the nurse from Vandermeer," Nora said. A pause. "You have no idea what you've disrupted." "I have a fairly complete idea," Nora said. 7 dead patients, multiple facilities, a compound derived from a discontinued DOD program, a private buyer for a proof-of-concept capability that kills people while looking like natural organ failure. She kept her voice even. "I have a pretty good idea." Something shifted in Torrance's expression. Not admiration, not respect in any form Nora wanted, but the acknowledgement of someone who has encountered a level of competence they hadn't anticipated from a source they'd underestimated. It lasted less than a second. Then it was gone, replaced by the composed mask she'd walked in with. "I'd like to speak with my attorneys," Torrance said. "Step out of the room," Rourke said. "Sus." The search of the facility took 4 hours and produced more than the warrant had been written to expect. The research wing on the 3rd floor contained a fully operational laboratory with compound samples in cold storage. 12 variants and labeled vials that the forensic specialist photographed and cataloged with the focused attention of someone who understood that each vial was a piece of evidence and also, abstractly, a marker for a version of the compound that had been refined from the deaths of real people. Clinical trial documentation going back 3 years, subject records that used numerical codes instead of names, but which cross-referenced against a separate key document that the forensic team found in a locked cabinet in the research director's office. And those codes, run against the patient profile parameters Nora had given Rourke that morning, resolved into names, real names, across 4 states. 31 total, not 7. 31. Nora was in the corridor outside the research wing when Rourke came out and told her the number. She stood with it for a moment. 31 people who had come into hospitals for manageable conditions and had died in the service of someone's proof of concept. 31 families who had been told their loved ones had died of natural causes and had believed it because hospitals were supposed to be places where that was the only kind of death. She breathed through it. She put it down. "Ford," she said. "In custody as of 40 minutes ago. They picked him up in the facility's parking area. He'd been waiting inside." Rourke's voice had a particular flatness. He was carrying a hard drive and a phone. He told the arresting agent he wanted to cooperate. He was going to give her the drive, Nora said. Ford came here to hand Torrance whatever he'd pulled from Vandermeer's secondary server before the deletion sequence ran. He thought he was bringing something that would protect him. Instead, he walked into a facility that was already being searched and handed us additional evidence. Rourke paused. "He's asking for a deal. Does he have enough to offer?" "The buyer," Rourke said. "He claims to know who the buyer is." Nora looked at her. "He says it's not a private individual. It's a state actor, a foreign government intermediary operating through a series of financial shells that Helix Corp had been using to route payment in advance of capability delivery." Rourke held her gaze. "If that's true, this isn't a pharmaceutical research crime. It's something else." "Does Torrance know he's talking?" "She will soon." "Then whatever deal structure he thinks he's offering, she's already working on neutralizing it." Nora thought through it in real time, the way she thought through things when the decision window was measured in minutes. She doesn't need to discredit him. She needs to make his testimony insufficient on its own, which means she has documentation, something that implicates people above the level she's willing to sacrifice. "You think she's got her own insurance package?" She built a 4-year covert research program that survived a federal investigation and put the investigator in a care facility. She didn't do that without keeping documentation of every person who participated and every decision they signed off on. Nora paused. "She's going to offer it, not to you, to whoever above your level can make a deal that protects her core exposure." Rourke was quiet for a moment. Then, "Stay here." She went back into the research wing. Nora stood in the corridor and looked at the facility around her. The clean lines and functional design of a building that had been used to do something that had no clean lines at all, and that had looked, from the outside, exactly like what legitimate research was supposed to look like. Her phone buzzed. Walt. "It's on the news," he said. "Vandermeer, federal search. They're not naming you yet, but they will." "I know." "You okay?" She thought about how to answer that accurately. "I'm standing in a building in Portland that has 31 names on a list inside it. I'm okay." Walt was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet about things that cost something. "You need anything?" "Not right now. I'll call you tonight." She put the phone away. Victor Salter had been talking for 2 hours by the time the federal agent in the room with him shifted his approach from documentation to interrogation. Salter was a 61-year-old physician who had spent his career in institutional medicine and understood, in a structural way, how institutions protected people who were useful to them and discarded people who weren't. He understood that he was in the process of being discarded. He understood that the question now was how much of what came next he could shape by the quality and completeness of what he offered. So he talked. He told them about the initial approach from a Helix Corp representative, not Torrance herself, a man named Devlin who'd come through a medical conference connection and framed the program as advanced observational research with therapeutic intent. He told them about the patient selection criteria he'd been given, the compound delivery integration into standard medication protocols, the documentation alteration system that allowed the EMR to be updated remotely through a secondary server access the hospital's main IT department didn't know existed. He told them about the 4 other physicians across the network who had roles similar to his, names, hospital affiliations, approximate timelines. He told them about the money, the routing structure, the amounts, the account that had been set up for him through a financial management company that Helix Corp had recommended and that had never filed anything that connected to Helix Corp's name. He told them all of it with the flat, sequenced precision of a man who had decided that the story he'd been telling himself was over and that the only productive remaining question was how far the truth could get him from where he'd ended up. He did not minimize. He did not claim he hadn't known what the compound did. He did not say he'd been deceived about the patient outcomes. He said, "I knew. I convinced myself it was acceptable because of the framing I was given, and then I continued because stopping would have required me to account for what I'd already done, and I wasn't prepared to do that." The federal agent, a man named Torres, who'd been doing this work for 11 years, had heard a lot of confessions shaped by a lot of different psychological architectures. He noted in his written summary that Salter's account had the unusual quality of someone not performing remorse, but actually processing it in real time. That the man seemed to be understanding the full shape of his actions as he described them, rather than having arrived at the interview already knowing what he thought about what he'd done. Torres noted it. He didn't find it exculpatory, but he noted it. At 2:47 p.m., Salter was placed under arrest. He was handcuffed at the table in the interview room, and he sat through the process with the stillness of someone who had already been somewhere worse than this, inside themselves, and had decided that the exterior geography of the situation didn't have anything left to take from him. The news broke publicly at 3:15 p.m., not a controlled release from the DOJ press office that was being drafted, but drafting took time. And time was something the story didn't wait for. What broke first was a photograph. Federal vehicles outside Vandermeer Medical Center, taken by someone on the sidewalk with a phone, posted to a local news social media account with a caption about a federal search at a regional hospital. Within 20 minutes, the photograph had generated enough traffic that 2 local TV stations had reporters in the Vandermeer parking lot. Within an hour, it had hit the wire services. The coverage was initially vague. Federal search, patient safety review, details pending. But vague coverage in a vacuum created its own dynamics, and the dynamics produced calls to the hospital's communications office, which had no authorized spokesperson because the CEO was in federal custody and the CFO was in the process of retaining a criminal defense attorney and declining to comment on anything. The absence of a spokesperson communicated more than a spokesperson would have. By 4 p.m., someone inside the hospital had talked to a reporter. The story that emerged was partial and not entirely accurate in its details, but its shape was correct. Patients had died. An investigation had been opened. A nurse had raised concerns and been suspended. A federal task force was involved. A nurse had raised concerns and been suspended. That detail spread faster than the others. Nora was still at this Helix Corp facility when Rourke found her in a ground-floor conference room where she'd been going through the cross-referenced patient name list with a forensic specialist, working to identify which of the 31 names could be matched to documented deaths versus disappearances from the patient record. Rourke put a phone on the table in front of her showing a news article. The headline read, "Federal Investigation into Vandermeer Medical Center. Sources say suspended nurse first raised alarm." She read the first 3 paragraphs. She put the phone down. "I didn't talk to anyone," she said. "I know, someone inside the hospital did." Rourke looked at her. "Your name isn't in the article, but it will be. Once it is, the press is going to want to talk to you." "I know. How you handle that is your decision. I'd recommend waiting until the DOJ puts out a statement with accurate information so you're not working against a partial narrative." "When's the statement?" "Tonight, 8 p.m. at the earliest." Nora looked at the phone, at the headline, at the 3 paragraphs that had gotten most of the facts wrong and the core truth right, because that was how this kind of story almost always moved, the shape outrunning the details, the broad truth arriving before the specific truth was ready, and the people involved having to exist in the gap between them. She turned the phone face down and went back to the name list. At 5:30 p.m., Torrance's lead attorney requested a meeting with the lead federal prosecutor, which was not a meeting Rourke was in, but which she was briefed on afterward in the facility parking area while the last of the evidence bags were being loaded. "She's offering the buyer," Rourke said. Her voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it that wasn't quite contained. "Full documentation on the financial structure, the intermediary network, the communications chain going back to the first payment." She paused. "In exchange for a cooperation agreement that substantially limits her personal criminal exposure on the research program." "She's going to walk," Nora said. "She's not going to walk, but she's trying to reduce to a position where she does something that isn't multiple life sentences." Rourke looked at the facility. "The prosecutor hasn't accepted yet." "The buyer identity?" if it's what Ford indicated, a foreign state actor, that moves this to a level where the calculation changes. The people above you start weighing the intelligence value against the justice value. Yes, Nora was quiet for a moment. She knew this calculus. She'd seen it operate in other contexts, under other names, with other people's lives as the currency being exchanged. The system that produced justice and the system that produced intelligence were the same system, and sometimes they wanted different things. And when they did, justice was the one that moved. The 31 patients, she said, their families. Yes, I know. Rourke said it flatly, without the performance of sympathy, which was actually a form of respect. That's the fight that comes next. This is where we are right now. It wasn't a satisfying answer. It was an honest one, which was worth more. Nora looked at the Helix Corp building, 3 stories of glass and gray stone that had looked clean and functional and had contained, on its 3rd floor, a laboratory where variants of a compound were stored in 12 labeled vials, and 31 people's deaths were recorded in coded numbers that had needed a key to become names. She looked at it until it was just a building again, which didn't take as long as she expected. What happens to Vandermeer? She asked. State Health Authority will maintain administrative oversight during the federal investigation. They'll appoint an interim administrator. A pause. The hospital stays open. The patients on the floor right now need care regardless of what the institution did. The nursing staff, the physicians who weren't involved, they keep working. Becca, Ferris, they're cooperating witnesses, protected status, they keep their jobs. Nora nodded. Something settled slightly, not all the way, but enough to register. Her phone buzzed. Marcus Feld. She stepped away from Rourke and answered it. I was wondering when you'd call. I've been busy, he said. His voice had the particular quality of someone who'd been working for 18 hours straight and wasn't going to stop. The Montana and Colorado facilities have been contacted. State authorities are executing their own warrants based on the information package. The Nevada case, the original DOJ inquiry, is being reopened. Patrick Seo's family has been notified, and a medical review of his care facility has been initiated. She processed all of it. The buyer. Do you have independent confirmation? Working on it. What we have is Ford's account and the financial trail from the server imaging. The trail is strong, but it's not complete enough to move on without the documentation Torrance is holding. So she has leverage. For now. A pause. Nora. The Attorney General's office is aware of this case, personally aware, not through channels, directly briefed this afternoon. He let that sit. This isn't going to get buried. She heard what he was saying, that the system had failed Patrick Seo 14 months ago, had buried his inquiry and put him in a room somewhere, that it was possible for this to go the same way, and that the reason it wasn't going to go the same way was that enough people at enough levels now knew, and the size of the documented record made burial more dangerous than exposure. Thank you, she said, and meant it in the specific, non-sentimental way that she meant things when they mattered. She ended the call and turned back to the parking area where Rourke was finishing up with the evidence team. The late afternoon light had dropped to the flat gray of early evening in Oregon, and the facility's exterior lights had come on automatically, the clean, functional illumination of a building that looked exactly like what it had claimed to be. She stood in it for a moment, the work she'd started 11 days ago in a hospital corridor, looking at an IV bag label and feeling her eyes stop on a font variant, had arrived here. 31 names, multiple states, an international buyer, a federal investigation with the Attorney General's personal attention, and a woman on the 3rd floor of this building deciding what to sacrifice. It wasn't finished. It was nowhere near finished, but the direction had reversed, and the reversal was irreversible, and that was not a small thing. She was about to walk toward Rourke when her phone rang. Not Feld, not Walt, not Becca or Ferris or the prepaid number. The number on the screen was one she didn't recognize, not an Oregon area code, not a number in her contacts. She almost didn't answer it. She answered it. Ms. Callahan. The voice was male, older, with the measured cadence of someone who chose words with the precision of someone who understood what words cost. My name is Deputy Inspector General Warren Pruitt. I work under direct authorization of the Department of Defense Inspector General's office. I've been briefed on your investigation in the past 2 hours. She waited. I'm going to tell you something that hasn't been released to the investigating team yet. I'm telling you first because you have the background to understand it and because what I'm about to say affects your personal safety. A pause. The compound program that Helix Corp was running did not originate with Sylvia Torrance. Nora stood very still. Torrance was the program director, she said. She was the program director for the civilian iteration. The original program, the DoD-funded version before it was archived, had a different principal investigator, a different chain of authorization. That chain went higher than the program's official DoD classification level. Another pause, deliberate, not for effect, but because what he was saying required space to land correctly. The program was archived 4 years ago because someone above the authorization level decided the methodology was too visible, not too harmful, too visible. The intent was to move it to a structure that had no federal fingerprints, Helix Corp. Helix Corp was the vehicle, but the original authorization, the decision to continue the program after archiving, did not come from Torrance. She was chosen to run it because she was capable and because she had exposure from the original program that could be used to ensure her continued participation. Nora thought about Torrance in the conference room, looking at her across the table. The expression that had crossed her face for less than a second, the composed mask that had followed. Torrance isn't the top, Nora said. She's another node. Yes. Then who? The documentation she's offering the prosecutor, Pruitt said, does not go to a foreign buyer. Ford's account of a foreign state actor is either a misunderstanding or a deliberate misdirection. The financial chain, when fully traced, goes to a domestic source. His voice didn't change. It didn't need to. A domestic source with sufficient institutional authority to have Patrick Seo's inquiry closed 14 months ago, with sufficient reach to have ensured that the program's federal archiving was procedurally clean enough that no one looked at what was underneath it. The facility's exterior lights hummed. Somewhere in the building behind her, evidence was being boxed and labeled and prepared for a chain of custody that led to federal court. You're telling me that the investigation we're running, Nora said slowly, is potentially heading towards someone with the authority to interfere with the investigation. I'm telling you that the documentation package you built, the original package, the one you constructed before anyone else knew this case existed, is the only piece of this that has an unbroken chain of custody that cannot be explained away by institutional pressure. He paused. Which means your documentation is the spine of this case, and the people who would prefer this case not proceed are aware of that. The man outside my apartment, she said, was not from Helix Corp, Pruitt said. Helix Corp didn't know your address. The parking area was very quiet around her. Rourke was 30 meters away, her back turned, talking to a forensic agent. The evidence van was loaded. The building's lights were on and the evening was coming down around everything, and somewhere in the sequence of things that were happening, a variable had just shifted in a direction that changed the geometry of everything she'd thought she understood about her situation. How long have you known about this case? Nora asked. 18 hours, Pruitt said, from the moment Feld's flag crossed my desk. Why are you calling me instead of Rourke? A pause that was not evasive. It was the pause of someone calibrating honesty. Because Rourke's chain of command goes through people I'm currently investigating, and because you are the one person in this case who has been operating independently of every institutional structure that has a potential conflict of interest. He paused again. You need to understand what you're holding, Ms. Callahan, and you need to understand that the people who want to take it from you are not all the people you've already identified. Das something siches. She stood in the parking area with the phone pressed to her ear and looked at the facility and at Rourke's back and at the evidence van and at the gray Oregon evening coming down over all of it. Send me what you have, she said. Already sent, encrypted. The key is the last 4 digits of your Federal Service clearance number. A pause. You know those digits? She did. Be careful, Ms. Callahan. He said it without drama, which was the only way it meant anything. Not of Torrance, not of Ford. Be careful of the thing above them that has been careful about itself for a very long time. He ended the call. Nora lowered the phone. She looked at Rourke across the parking area, a federal agent with a warrant and a team and 17 years of institutional affiliation that ran through a chain of command that Pruitt was currently investigating. A person Nora had decided to trust provisionally and had found, in the course of the day, to be trustworthy in the ways that mattered. But provisional trust and complete trust were different things, And the difference had just become the most consequential variable in the room. She stood with her phone in her hand and the encrypted message sitting unopened on it, and she thought about what Pruitt had said. You are the one person in this case who has been operating independently of every institutional structure with a potential conflict of interest. 31 names, a network across 4 states, a foreign buyer that wasn't a foreign buyer, and somewhere above all of it, a domestic source with the reach to close a federal inquiry and send someone to stand outside a nurse's apartment in the dark. Rourke turned around. Across the parking area, she looked at Nora. Ready? Nora put her phone in her jacket pocket with the encrypted message still unopened. Yes, she said. She walked toward the car. She kept her face composed and her pace steady, and her mind working on a problem that had just doubled in size and halved the number of people she could fully trust to help her solve it. She got in the passenger seat. Rourke got in the driver's seat. The evidence van pulled out ahead of them. And on Nora's phone in her jacket pocket, the encrypted message from Warren Pruitt sat waiting, containing, if he was telling the truth, the identity of the source at the top of the chain that had turned 31 people into data points and called it research, and if he was not telling the truth, containing something else entirely. She didn't open it. Not yet. The drive back to Caldwell Falls took 2 hours and 14 minutes, and Nora spent most of it looking out the passenger window at the dark highway, not sleeping, not talking, running the problem the way she ran every problem that mattered. From the edges inward, testing each boundary before she trusted it. Pruitt had called her instead of Rourke. That was either because he was genuinely trying to protect an uncompromised evidence chain, or because he was himself a variable in a larger structure she hadn't mapped yet. And the call was designed to isolate her from the investigating team at a critical moment. Both were possible. She'd been in enough situations to know that the person who offered you protection and the person who needed you isolated were sometimes the same person, and the offer looked identical from the outside. She didn't open the encrypted message. She also didn't tell Rourke about the call. What she did instead was think about the thing Pruitt had said that felt true, regardless of his intentions. You are the one person in this case who has been operating independently of every institutional structure with a potential conflict of interest. That was either a warning or a manipulation, but either way, it was accurate. The documentation she'd built before anyone knew this case existed, the lab report, the pharmacy photographs, the chain of custody for the vial, the written account of everything she'd observed, was the only piece of the evidentiary structure that had no institutional fingerprint on it. No federal case number, no chain of command above it. Just a nurse who had watched 3 patients die and had refused to accept the institutional explanation for why. That mattered. She needed to understand why it mattered before she made the next decision. Rourke dropped her at the motel at 9:47 p.m. and said she'd be in contact in the morning. There was a moment at the car where Rourke looked at her. The same sustained look from the parking structure that morning, the same quality of reassessment, and seemed about to say something more. She didn't. She drove away. Nora stood in the motel parking lot for a moment watching the taillights, then went inside. She sat on the bed with her phone and opened a browser and searched Warren Pruitt, Deputy Inspector General, Department of Defense. The result that came back was real. A photograph, a brief official biography, a tenure that went back 9 years. She searched his name against the DOD-IG's public case records. 3 closed investigations, all public, all unremarkable. Nothing that screamed cover or credential fabrication. She sat with that for a moment. Then she opened the encrypted message. The decryption key was the last 4 digits of her Federal Service Clearance number, which was a number she'd never written down anywhere, which meant Pruitt had obtained it through the same channels that had made her employment record partially redacted, meaning he had the clearance level to access classified personnel records, which was consistent with a Deputy Inspector General and inconsistent with someone manufacturing a cover. The message decrypted into a document that was 47 pages long. She read it in an hour and 20 minutes, which was fast, but she read the way she'd been trained to read intelligence documents, for structure first, detail second, looking for the shape of the claim before she weighed the specifics. What the document contained was a financial and operational audit trail going back 6 years, assembled from sources the document described as signals intelligence intercepts, financial forensics, and 3 confidential informants whose designations were redacted. The trail moved from Helix Corp's founding through its subsidiary network, through the research program funding, and into a structure that Pruitt's document called, with the dry precision of a man who'd spent a career naming things accurately, an unauthorized domestic research acceleration program. Unauthorized, meaning someone with authorization-level access had run it without proper authorization. Not a rogue actor at the margins of the system. Someone inside the system operating outside its rules while using its resources. The name at the top of the chain was a man named Caldwell Merritt, Assistant Deputy Director for Research Programs at the Defense Advanced Research Programs Administration, a position that carried enough bureaucratic ambiguity to provide cover and enough real authority to make things happen. He'd been in the position for 7 years. He had 3 government commendations. He was 63 years old, and until the moment Nora read his name in a document on a motel bed in Oregon at 11:15 at night, had been invisible to her in the way that people who are careful about their invisibility are invisible. He had authorized the original DoD compound research program. He had then authorized its archiving in a way that left the program technically closed and operationally intact. He had connected Torrance to the private funding structure that became Helix Corp. He had, 14 months ago, made 2 phone calls that had resulted in Patrick Seo's inquiry being closed and Patrick Seo's career being ended, and Patrick Seo himself being placed in a care facility under circumstances that Pruitt's document described, carefully and with full documentation, as coerced medical confinement. He had done all of this because the compound's intended final application, the thing the research was building toward, the capability Helix Corp was preparing to demonstrate for a buyer, was not a foreign sale. It was domestic. A targeting capability refined to the point of undetectability, available to whoever controlled it. Merritt intended to control it. Nora sat with that for a long time. Not with shock. Shock wasn't a response she had much use for, and the architecture of what she was reading had a logic to it that, once you understood the first 3 layers, made the rest inevitable. She sat with it the way she sat with things that required her to be honest about what they meant. It meant that the investigation currently running through the DOJ and the Federal Task Force was heading toward Torrance and Ford and the Helix Corp network, and that those were real crimes with real evidence and real accountability coming. It also meant that the person who'd built the structure those crimes operated inside was, at this moment, watching the investigation through whatever visibility his position gave him and deciding which pieces he could let fall and which pieces he needed to protect. He'd sent someone to her apartment. That meant he knew she was a variable he hadn't fully accounted for. She picked up her phone and called Feld. It was 11:28 p.m. He answered in 2 rings, which meant he wasn't sleeping either. "I need to send you something," she said. "Tonight. And I need you to tell me whether you know the name Caldwell Merritt." A pause that lasted long enough to be its own answer. "Where did you get that name, Mom?" he said. "Pruitt." Another pause. "He called you." "Yes." "When?" 6:30 this evening, parking area at the Helix facility. She kept her voice even. "You know him." "I know of him. I've been looking at the edges of that name for about 3 months. His voice had the quality of someone who had just had a calculation resolve. "The financial trail from the server imaging. I've been following one branch that doesn't connect to Torrance. I didn't have a name for it yet." "You have one now." She sent him the document through the encrypted channel they'd been using. 47 pages. "Read the last 12 first. That's where the authorization chain is." She heard him pulling up the file. She waited. "Nora." His voice had changed. Not alarmed, but with a weight to it. "This is DODIG sourcing. If this is real, check the source designations against the financial forensics you already have. If they cross-reference, it's real." A long pause. The sound of someone reading fast. "The account routing on page 31. That matches a branch I flagged 2 weeks ago and couldn't trace." He stopped. "It matches. Then we have him. We have documentation that points to him. That's not the same as having him." A pause. "The Attorney General's office needs this tonight, not tomorrow. Tonight." "I know. That's why I called you and not Rourke." Silence on the line. She could hear Feld understanding what she wasn't saying, that Rourke's chain of command ran through structures that Merritt had access to, that the document needed to go somewhere that couldn't be intercepted, that the person who could ensure it got there was someone who'd been operating outside the institutional grid since before the investigation officially existed. "Give me 40 minutes, he said. She sat on the motel bed with her shoes on and waited. She thought about what was going to happen in the next 40 minutes, in the next 40 hours, and what would come after that. She thought about what it meant to have walked into a hospital 2 years ago to do direct patient care and to have ended up here. Not because she'd been looking for it, but because she'd looked directly at something instead of away from it, and then kept looking when the institutional architecture told her to stop. She didn't think of herself as brave. She thought of herself as someone who had a specific and durable inability to pretend she hadn't seen what she'd seen. That wasn't the same thing as courage. It was closer to stubbornness, or to a kind of psychological integrity that didn't leave her much choice. She'd been in situations where looking away was the survivable option, and she'd looked anyway, and she'd lived with the consequences of that, and she was living with them now. At 12:14 a.m., Feld called back. "It's with the AG's office, delivered through a channel that has no connection to Merritt's oversight structure." A pause. "They're moving on it at 6 a.m. 6 hours. Yes, Nora, you need to be somewhere secure until this is done. I'm at a motel. On your own card? Cash. Okay," he exhaled. "Stay there. Don't go back to your apartment. Don't contact Rourke until after 6. She didn't tell him that not contacting Rourke felt wrong in a way that was worth examining, that she'd spent the day working beside a federal agent who'd made a good call on the medication hold and a worse call about Ford's car and a series of judgment calls in between that had been, as far as she could assess, made honestly. That trust was not the same as institutional trust, that a person could be trustworthy and still have a chain of command above them that compromised the outcome. She didn't say any of that. She said, "I'll be here." She put the phone down and lay back on the motel bed and looked at the ceiling and let herself feel, for approximately 5 minutes, the specific exhaustion of the past 12 days. Not physically, though that was there too, but the other kind. The kind that came from sustained high-stakes attention, from making decisions in compressed windows with incomplete information, from carrying something alone for long enough that the weight had become part of the posture. She felt it. She put it down. She closed her eyes. She didn't sleep. At 6:04 a.m., federal agents arrested Caldwell Merritt at his home in Northern Virginia. The arrest was executed by a team operating under a warrant issued by a federal judge who had been briefed at 2 a.m. by the Attorney General's office directly, bypassing the standard chain of authorization that Merritt's position gave him partial visibility into. He came to the door in a bathrobe. He looked at the credentials and the warrant and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said he wanted his attorney. He was 63 years old, and he had spent 31 years building a career in the institutional architecture of the federal government. And he understood in the 3 seconds between seeing the warrant and saying those 4 words that the architecture he'd been building inside that career, the one he'd told himself was about national security and capability development and staying ahead of adversaries who didn't share American constraints, had just come down. He'd made the same error that Ford had made, that Salter had made, that every person in the network had made in their own register. He'd assumed that the risk was bounded by what he could see. He'd managed Torrance's exposure and Ford's exposure, and had closed CO's inquiry and had sent someone to stand outside an apartment in Oregon. He'd done all of this with the confidence of someone who understood systems and had spent years ensuring that the system protected him. He hadn't accounted for the person who'd been operating entirely outside the system. The person who'd built a case on a kitchen table with cash and a prepaid phone and a lab report folded in a jacket pocket, and who had done it before anyone above her knew there was a case to build. He dismissed her as a variable because she was a night shift nurse. That was the error that cost him everything. The DOJ press conference was at 10 a.m. Eastern, which was 7 a.m. Oregon time, and Nora watched it on her phone in the motel room with a cup of coffee from the machine in the hallway that was genuinely terrible and that she drank anyway. The Attorney General's spokesperson read from a prepared statement. Federal charges against Caldwell Merritt, Sylvia Torrance, Damon Ford, and Victor Salter, along with 11 additional individuals across the Helix Court network. Charges including unauthorized human experimentation, conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction of federal investigation, and in Merritt's case, abuse of federal authority, and conspiracy to suppress federal inquiry. The investigation had identified 31 confirmed victims across 4 states. Patrick Seo's case was being reviewed. The compound research program had been fully documented and preserved as evidence and would not be destroyed or archived. The spokesperson then said that the investigation had been initiated by documentation compiled by a nurse at Vandermeer Medical Center in Caldwell Falls, Oregon, who had identified the pattern of patient deaths and preserved physical evidence at significant personal risk, including after being suspended from her position by the hospital's administration. The spokesperson did not name Nora Callahan. That was deliberate. Rourke had called at 6:45 a.m. to tell her that her name was being withheld from the public statement at the request of the IG's office for her own protection, and that it would become part of the public record when the case went to trial unless she chose otherwise. Rourke had also said, at the end of that call, in a voice that had set aside its professional register for a moment, "I owe you an honest conversation about last night. I know you made a decision not to tell me about Pruitt's call. I understand why. I want you to know that I understand why." Nora had said, "I know you do." A pause. "I'm glad you didn't go back to your apartment." "Me too." She watched the press conference on her phone until it ended, and then she sat with the terrible coffee and the morning coming through the curtains and the particular quality of a moment that had arrived after a long approach, and felt, now that she was in it, less like victory and more like the cessation of something very loud. 31 people were still dead. That didn't change because Merritt was in handcuffs. It didn't change because Torrance was being processed, or Ford was cooperating, or Salter was sitting somewhere trying to understand the full shape of his own decisions. The 31 names were still names. The families were still families. The grief was still grief, and the system that had made the program possible had not been dismantled. It had been interrupted, which was not the same thing, and she was old enough and had seen enough to know the difference. She thought about what it meant to have done what she'd done and to not be able to call it a clean ending, because it wasn't. It was a necessary ending. It was a right ending. But the world that came after it was the same world that had produced Helix Corp. And Caldwell Merritt and 31 patients used as data points, and that world was going to keep producing things that needed people to look directly at them instead of away. She drank the terrible coffee and sat with all of that. 3 days later, Vandermeer Medical Center's interim administrator, a woman named Dr. Priya Okonkwo, appointed by the state health authority, called Nora's personal phone. "I'd like to meet with you," she said. "At your convenience." "What about?" "Your suspension and what comes next." They met the following morning at a coffee shop 2 blocks from the hospital. Okonkwo was 50, direct, with the quality of someone who had been brought in to stabilize a damaged institution and had no investment in the damaged institution's prior self-image. She had a folder on the table that she opened without preamble. "Your suspension is formally rescinded, effective yesterday morning," she said. The board voted unanimously. The suspension was retaliatory, undocumented as a performance action, and predicated on conduct, unauthorized system access, that the board's legal review has determined was justified given the circumstances. Nora looked at the folder. "What's the circumstances determination based on?" "The fact that the system access was the means by which you documented an active patient safety crisis that hospital administration was suppressing." Okonkwo's voice was even. "The fact that 3 patients had already died and a 4th was saved in part because of the information you obtained." She paused. "And the fact that your supervisor was an active participant in the program that killed those patients, which means the access you used his colleagues' credentials to obtain was in the service of exposing his crimes." Nora sat with that. She hadn't thought about it in those terms, not because she disagreed, but because she'd been too focused on what needed to happen next to spend time on the formal accounting of what had already happened. "Your position is available if you want it," Okonkwo said. "Night shift, medical surgical unit, same grade, with a back pay resolution for the suspension period." She paused. "I'll also say, and this is not a condition of the reinstatement offer, just information, the state authority and the hospital board are creating a patient safety advocacy coordinator position. It's new. We're writing the job description. The person in it would have independent reporting authority directly to the state authority, bypassing hospital administration. They'd review mortality patterns, medication systems, anything that fits a concern flag profile." She closed the folder. I thought you should know it exists. Nora looked at the table for a moment. Who would that person report to? She asked. The state authority's patient safety division, not the hospital CEO, not any hospital administrator. Okonkwo looked at her steadily. It was designed specifically so that the person in it cannot be suppressed by the institution they're reviewing. Nora thought about 2 years and 3 months of night shifts and the particular grinding, essential labor of keeping people alive in a system that didn't always make it easy. She thought about what it meant to have that work turned into the foundation of something that reached further than the work itself. She thought about Becca noticing a font discrepancy on a delivery confirmation and not knowing what to do with it. She thought about Ferris photographing call logs at 2 in the morning and calling her from a personal line. I want to stay on the floor, she said. Part-time. I'm not giving that up. Okonkwo looked at her. That's unusual for a coordinator position. I know. A pause. I'll put it to the board. I'd appreciate it. They shook hands across the table. It wasn't a warm moment. Neither of them were particularly warm people, and the situation didn't require warmth. It required directness, and they'd both brought it, and that was sufficient. The trials took time. They always did. Torrance's cooperation agreement fell apart 6 weeks after her arrest, when the prosecutor determined that the documentation she was offering in exchange for reduced exposure was itself partially fabricated, specifically the chain implicating the foreign buyer that had never existed. Ford, to his apparent surprise, had been telling the truth about the foreign actor. Torrance had fed him false information about the buyer's identity to maintain a layer of deniability that she'd intended to use as a bargaining chip. When the chip turned out to be fake, her leverage disappeared. She was charged on all counts. Her attorney's position became considerably less strategic after that. Forde cooperated fully. His cooperation bought him a reduced sentence, 12 years, eligible for parole at 8, that satisfied almost nobody, which was usually the sign that a deal was about as equitable as these deals got. He gave the prosecution everything he had on Merritt's authorization chain, and that testimony, combined with Pruitt's document and the financial forensics Feld had spent 3 months assembling, built a case against Merritt that went to trial 8 months after his arrest. Merritt's defense argued that his role was organizational, that he'd established a framework without directing its implementation, that the research program's methodology had been the responsibility of Torrance and her team, that the authorization chain didn't constitute personal criminal involvement. It was the argument of a man who had spent 30 years in systems where the person at the top of a chain could credibly maintain distance from the bottom. It didn't hold. The jury took 4 days. Guilty on all counts: conspiracy to commit murder, abuse of federal authority, obstruction of federal inquiry, coerced confinement of a federal investigator. The sentencing judge, a woman in her late 60s who'd been on the federal bench for 22 years and had seen enough of human capacity for self-justification to last several lifetimes, looked at Merritt across the courtroom before reading the sentence and said something that wasn't part of the formal proceedings. Something she said quietly, more to herself than to the room, but which a reporter in the gallery heard clearly enough to quote, 31 people came to hospitals to be helped and were selected to die because someone with power decided their lives were a resource. I want that on the record, even if it isn't part of the verdict. Caldwell Merritt received 4 consecutive life sentences. He would die in a federal facility. That was the outcome the system produced for him, and it was the correct outcome, and Nora read about it in a news alert on her phone while she was sitting at a nursing station on the medical surgical floor at Vandermeer at 3:30 in the morning, documenting a medication administration for a 67-year-old woman who had come in with pneumonia and was, by every indication, going to go home in 4 days. She read the alert. She put the phone down. She finished the documentation. Salter's trial came after Merritt's. He'd cooperated extensively, and his cooperation had mattered. Several of the network physicians had been identified and charged based on information he provided. His sentencing reflected this. 14 years, no parole eligibility for 10. The judge in his case noted that Salter's cooperation, while genuine, did not alter the fundamental nature of what he'd done, that he'd been in a position to stop it, had understood what it was, and had continued. 14 years. Nora thought it wasn't enough. She also thought that what was enough was a question that the law answered imperfectly and that she wasn't qualified to improve on, and that the imperfect answer was still an answer, which was better than the silence that had preceded it. Helix Corp was dissolved by federal order. Its assets were liquidated. The proceeds went into a victim compensation fund for the families of the 31 confirmed patients, administered by the DOJ in consultation with the state health authority offices in Oregon, Nevada, Montana, and Colorado. It wasn't adequate compensation. Money wasn't adequate compensation for a death that should not have happened, but it was the form that institutional accountability took when it was working correctly, which was better than the form it took when it wasn't. Patrick Co. was released from the private care facility in Washington 2 weeks after Merritt's arrest. His family had retained a civil attorney. His cognitive function, according to the neurologist who evaluated him on release, was largely intact. Whatever had been done to him had been intended to create a plausible medical record rather than a permanent condition, which was the particular calculation of someone who was careful about the level of harm they needed. He spent 6 weeks at home before he gave a deposition that lasted 3 days. When it was entered into the trial record, portions of it were read into open court. The portions that described what had been done to him, how the inquiry had been closed, the calls that had been made, the sequence of events that ended with him in a room he hadn't agreed to be in, were not dramatic in any cinematic sense. They were plain and sequential and specific. They were the account of a careful man describing, carefully, what had been done to him by a system he'd served and trusted and that had turned on him for getting too close to the right answer. When the reading was finished, the courtroom was quiet for a long moment. The judge didn't fill the silence. She let it sit. On the day that Merritt's sentencing was announced, Nora was pulled into a call she hadn't expected. The call came through formal channels, a scheduling request from the Office of the Secretary of Defense, which was not a call she'd ever received before, and which she sat with for a full minute before accepting. The call itself lasted 45 minutes and covered ground she hadn't anticipated. A formal commendation from the Inspector General's office for her role in identifying and documenting the program, the restoration of her federal contractor credentials at a clearance level that matched her prior classification, and an offer, framed as optional with no pressure attached that she could detect, to consult with the IG's office on the development of a civilian medical facility monitoring protocol that would be designed to detect exactly the kind of anomaly she'd identified at Vandermeer. The call was conducted by Warren Pruitt, whose voice she recognized from the parking area. He was precise and professional, and when he described what she'd done in the formal language of the commendation, she felt the particular strangeness of hearing her own actions described from the outside. The way that what you do in the moment, out of necessity and stubbornness, and a specific refusal to stop looking at something, sounds different when someone with institutional authority renders it back to you in official terms. She thanked him. She told him she'd consider the consulting offer. She meant it. After the call, she sat in the break room at Vandermeer, the same break room where, 47 days ago, she'd been drinking cold coffee when the code was called overhead for Patricia Gund and had not gotten up for a full minute. She sat in it now with warm coffee and looked at the wall and thought about what it meant to be commended for something you'd done because you hadn't known how to do anything else. She thought about what the past 7 weeks had cost, not in dramatic terms, not in the currency of sacrifice that stories like to trade in the actual granular cost, the sleep she'd lost, the sustained tension of carrying something alone, the decisions made in compressed windows, the moment in the east wing of this building when she disconnected an IV line and said, "You're going to be okay," to a man she didn't know, and had meant it with everything she had. The 4 names on Becca's list that she hadn't been there for. The way that staying with those 4 names, not bracketing them, not processing them efficiently